Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Ichigo's stuck on Land of Shinobi, falls in love with Tsunade, Movie 1. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, AizenTheGoat, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic. Link is in the description. Let's start the story. Kurosaki Ichigo had been through a lot since the fiasco with Aizen. He managed to save Karakura and put a stop to the madman's plans involving his town. That wasn't to say everything had gone without a hitch. Beating Aizen had been a Herculean task. He knew deep down that Aizen had wanted to be beaten, but that didn't mean it could be done without sacrifice. Due to his protective nature, he'd taken it upon himself to protect Soul Society, and as a result, had given up his Shinigami powers in one final attack. Mujutsu by itself hadn't been enough, but thanks to the quick thinking and foresight of Urahara, the man had been sealed away. Losing his power had done more emotional damage than he could have accounted for. He knew he'd lose the ability to see his Shinigami friends, but it was a price he was willing to pay. Day in and day out he went through life as an ordinary man, but he soon found himself missing his old life. It wasn't until much later that his old life would somehow catch up to him, and he was once again pulled into the schemes of another madman. Ginjo Kugo had reached out to him, taught him how to hone a dormant power within him, under the guise of giving him his own power. He should have known that it was too good to be true, but the thought of regaining his power was too tempting. In the end, the worst-case scenario had come to pass. His friends and family had been brainwashed by the enemy of the Fullbringers, and Ichigo had soon found that it was all a ploy by the man that had reached out to him. His new power had been stolen and for the second time, he had been broken. That anguish didn't last however, as the familiar scene of a blade piercing his chest replayed itself, and he found himself with the power of the gods of death once more. Even with his stolen power, Ginjo was no match for the second substitute, and soon found himself face first in the concrete below them. Ichigo stared down at the bloody and broken form of Ginjo, who stared back at him with defiance clear in his eyes. If nothing else he had to admire the man's refusal to double over and die. He was on death's door, but his anger kept him from crossing to the other side. "It's over," the orange-haired man said, raising Zangetsu high into the air. Ginjo refused to close his eyes and die a coward, and in doing so, saw the blade stray from his path in order to block a strike from Tsukishima. Ichigo kept a single hand on the handle of his Zanpakuto as he held back the attack. The black-haired man's arms were shaking, and his legs were on the verge of giving out, but he managed to stay standing. Ichigo's eyes strayed from the man's angry face down to his chest. The white shirt he wore was bloodied, a red stain flowing down from the hole that had been seemingly punched through him. In a way it reminded him of when Ulquiorra had activated his second release, and had black fluid flowing out of his hollow hole. "I'm not sure which one you're worse at." Ichigo spoke in a chilling tone, looking from Tsukishima to Ginjo. "I thought you would have been taken care of by now." The Fullbringer didn't rise to the bait, instead pulling back and dashing forward with another strike. It was mildly impressive that even with a hole in his chest he was capable of moving around, even more so that he could still swing his blade. Regardless of how impressive his strength of will was, it wasn't enough to overcome the Shinigami. Sparks flew in different directions with every clash of their blades. Ichigo effortlessly intercepted each attack, knocking it off to the side before readying up and blocking the next. Taking a step back, Ichigo swung horizontally, going on the offensive for the first time. Tensa Zangetsu clashed with Tsukishima's Book of the End, the impact hard enough to send the Fullbringer soaring through the air and crashing into a tree. Making his way over him, Ichigo rested his Zanpakuto on his shoulder, angrily looking down at the broken man. "It won't be as easy for you as it was before Tsukishima," he spoke. "Just stop." His words fell on deaf ears however. Gripping his chest, the Fullbringer got himself upright and held his blade with both hands. At that moment, there was nothing on the man's mind but saving the man who had taken him in as a child. He owed Ginjo a debt, and he would do everything to repay it. "Have it your way," the Shinigami muttered. Had Tsukishima been in fighting condition, he still would have lost. Now that he too was on death's door, predicting his attacks and overpowering him was child's play. His opponent's movements were uncoordinated and erratic, no doubt in part to the pain he must be feeling at the moment. Bringing his Zanpakuto up, he blocked a diagonal slash and maneuvered it off to the side. With his defense broken, Ichigo kicked the man in the center of the chest. Tsukishima tumbled on the ground but once again stood up, this time even ignoring the protest from the former leader of Tsukushin. "Ichigo," said man turned to see Rukia watching on, her arms crossed in front of her with a fierce look on her face. "Neither of them stand a chance against you as you are now. Hurry up and finish them off," she ordered. Under normal circumstances, this would have begun a trade-off of words between them, each taking turns insulting or belittling one another. Now however, she was completely right. He paid them enough attention, and it was time they paid the price for their actions. "Yeah, I guess you're right," he replied. Turning his attention back to his opponent, Ichigo raised his Zanpakuto above him. A light green circle appeared below Tsukishima, indicating the usage of Bringer Light. Ichigo narrows his eyes and sighs. The black-haired man disappears from his spot, only to reappear in front of the Shinigami. At least, that's what he had counted on. Having easily seen through the attack, Tsukishima faced nothing but empty space. All he could see was the visage of Rukia staring at him with an uncaring look on her face. Ichigo stood next to him, blades still raised in the air. The book of the end user turned his head and witnessed the next moment as if it were in slow motion. Ichigo's cold brown eyes stared down at him with ill-concealed fury as he followed his trajectory. His lips moved, uttering 2 words, but they fell on deaf ears. The Shinigami as well as Ginjo, who was helplessly watching the battle, heard the name of the attack and braced for the shockwave that was sure to come. Itsuga Tensho. Black and red energy coated Zangetsu, and with a mighty swing, the battle ended. A horizontal pillar of energy consumed everything in its path, turning it into particles in the wind. The pillar of darkness died down, and not even the remains of Tsukishima's Fullbring remained. Then there was one. He muttered, staring at Ginjo. The Fullbringer had gotten back on his legs, knees shaking as he struggled to maintain a standing position. The former substitute Shinigami looked at the large burnt area where one of his longest-lasting friends had just been. Tsukishima. He said in a rough tone, the pain in his voice noticeable to everyone. The man clenched his fist in anger and sorrow, and turned his gaze to the person responsible for his demise. So you are capable of showing emotion for someone else? Ichigo noted. At one point, he probably would have felt for the man, but now, everyone in the vicinity felt the shift in the atmosphere the moment he finished speaking. Ginjo planted the large Zanpakuto into the ground, using it as a form of leverage for himself. Gripping the handle as hard as he could, he kept himself upright, his eyes still focused on the spot where his friend lost his life. Ichigo had to admire his resilience, but that wouldn't be enough to save him. After all the lies and betrayal, he wasn't in the most forgiving moods. The memory of the man's Zanpakuto piercing his chest and sucking away his Fullbring was still too fresh in his mind. Stay down, Ginjo, he warned, giving the man one final chance to stop. Just like with Tsukishima, his words had been ignored. Lifting the blade up onto his shoulders, Ginjo finally turned his attention to the orange-haired Shinigami. His eyes were ablaze with unrestrained fury. His knuckles were almost white with the amount of force he was exerting on the handle. You have only yourself to blame for this, Ginjo, he yelled out. You wanted revenge against the Shinigami for betraying you, but your mistake was getting my friends and family involved in this mess. If you want revenge, do it yourself when you get to Soul Society. Ginjo let out a loud yell, calling forth all of the available power left in his body. His Zanpakuto dragged behind him as he ran, hoping to use the momentum of his speed to turn his body for added force. When he was within reach, Ginjo swung horizontally, intending to cut the young man in half. Blade met flesh, but no blood was spilled. Ichigo's hand had extended out and caught the blade with little effort. In his current condition, even a child could have put more force behind the attack. Ginjo's jaw clenched and his teeth began to gnash against each other, as he realized years' worth of plans were about to go down the drain. Ichigo stared back with a stoic look on his face and spoke. It's over. Still having cross of scaffold gripped in his left hand, he pulled the man forward, making him stumble in the process. With a simple swing of his right hand, a large deep gash appeared on the chest of the leader of Skushin. Blood flew into the air from the open wound, staining the ground beneath them. The irony was not lost on him that he'd essentially done the same thing to Ginjo that Aizen had done to him during their first encounter. The only difference was Ginjo wouldn't be getting up. Ginjo's body reverted back to his pre-Bankai state as his body collapsed to the ground. Images of the life he lived, every good and bad moment passing him by in a fraction of a second. Ichigo's eyes followed his body until it collided with the ground, bouncing twice before staying completely still. The slight rising of his back continued for 4 seconds before there was no movement. He let out a sigh of relief and released his, reverting back to its usual state. It was finally over. Ginjo and Tsukishima were dead, meaning everyone should be right in their minds again. Had you not pulled that stun, Ginjo, maybe things would have ended differently. Ichigo thought to himself, allowing the massive cleaver to rest on his back once again. He smiled to himself at the familiar sensation of once again carrying Zangetsu. Turning around, he noticed most of the captains that had come to see him beginning to head back into the Sinkamen. Toshiro looked back and nodded to him respectfully. Giving the boy a single-handed wave, Ichigo turned to the Soul Shinigami, who had decided to temporarily stay behind. Ichigo. Rukia greeted with a small smile on her face. It's good to see you again. The smile on his face whitened marginally at her words. Yeah. It feels good to be back, he replied. So everyone gave a bit of their energy to get my powers back. Rukia nodded happily. That's right. Rukia hurried up, we gotta get back. He can talk to us tomorrow, isn't that right, Ichigo? Renji yelled from the front of the Sinkamen. And don't forget to bring the body, he called out afterwards. The petite Shinigami frowned at the task that had been metaphorically dropped on her lap, but shook her head and turned her attention back to her friend. Well, what do you say? Can you stop by tomorrow? Rukia asked, looking behind him at the bloodied form of Ginjo. Yeah, I'll be there. I'd love to see everybody again, he replied honestly. Nodding at his response, Rukia lugged the dead body behind her and made her way to the gate, only stopping once to look back at him before disappearing from view as the Sinkamen closed behind her. Now alone, Ichigo looked up at the night sky and couldn't help but chuckle. After everything that had happened, for the first time in a while, Ichigo felt truly happy. After what could be considered the best night's sleep of his life, Ichigo was ready to make his return to Soul Society. The thought of chatting with Rukia and Renji, Toshiro, hell even Kenpachi and Byakuya filled him with glee. After a good breakfast courtesy of Yuzu, he made his way over to Uraharu's. Pushing the doors open, he was greeted to the side of a grinning Uraharu. The man quickly pulled out his truss fan and covered the bottom half of his face as he usually did. "Well, if it isn't Ichigo, how are you doing?" he asked, pretending he didn't know about the man regaining his powers. On regular occasions, the man's eccentric nature would usually annoy the substitute Shinigami, but today he would make an exception. Flashing him a small smile, Ichigo shook his head and chuckled. "Doing better now, you know why I came here, right?" Uraharu nodded and waved his hand. "You need to get to Soul Society, right?" he asked. Not waiting for a response, he led his student down to the training grounds where he once learned, and began to process to open a Sinkamen for him. Ichigo watched, anticipation flooding his being as the shopkeeper worked. Within seconds, a flash of light illuminated the area. A horizontal line formed in the air before expanding into a large rectangle of light. Uraharu stood aside and motioned his left hand towards the gateway, with a pleased look on his face. "Go on, Ichigo, and enjoy yourself. You definitely deserve it," he said, tossing a small green orb which was easily caught out of the air. Ichigo rolled the soul candy in between his fingers for a moment and popped it in his mouth. His physical body and soul separated at once, allowing him to pass through the gate without issues. Adjusting the cleaver like Zanpakuto on his back, he took a step into the gate. "Well, let's get going then," he said to himself. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the corridor with each step. As he walked, his mind began to wander. How much had changed in the year and a half that he'd been gone? How would some of his friends react when he arrived? What would Yuki-take say? By now he'd surely know he knew of the purpose of the badge. All those questions ran through his mind as he continued forward. For a few minutes, things were uneventful. However, like everything that happened in his life, things soon began to go awry. Ichigo felt himself begin to shake, but soon realized it wasn't him, but rather the entire corridor. Looking around frantically, he stopped and came to a realization. The room was beginning to get brighter. That only happened when he was approaching, but he didn't see or hear anything. The shaking continued, and seeing no other choice, he dashed forward in an attempt to make it to the other side. The longer he ran, the more he frowned as he began to notice almost no distance was being covered, yet the light was beginning to get brighter. Frowning in confusion, he stopped for a split second. "Bankai!" he yelled, flooding the area with his. Now in his best form, he dashed away at full speed, but the problem persisted. The tunnel seemed to not end. Trying to keep his balance, he moved as fast as he could, but soon encountered another problem. Part of the wall next to him expanded, resembling a balloon that was taking in too much air. Knowing nothing good ever came of a scene like that, he crossed his arms to prepare for the incoming explosion. A moment after crossing his arms, a portion of the wall exploded before more began to explode in rapid succession. He could feel his arms beginning to burn from the continuous blasts, but was forced to keep his hands up. "Shit, the hell's going on?" wondered out loud. Blast after blast continued pushing him in a certain direction, front or back, he couldn't be sure at this point. After the fourth blast, he'd been sent airborne where the assault continued. It couldn't be the work of some enemy that he was aware of. Aizen was locked up, and Ginjo was dead, so what the hell was going on? The explosions had made easy work of the upper portion of his Shinigami clothing, making the burns begin to spread throughout his upper body. "I can't die like this, not after everything," he thought angrily. His vision was quickly fading, and he knew if the assault didn't stop, he would pass on in the void between worlds. As his world faded to black, he never noticed the moment he impacted with part of the wall, nor when the color of his eyes changed to resemble his hollow. The sounds of ongoing explosions reached his ears even as he lost consciousness, but what happened next was a mystery to him. XXXX. The throbbing pain in his head was the first thing he felt when he came to. Opening his eyes slowly, his right arm was quick to shield his face from the bright rays of the sun. It took a second for his brain to process three things. First, he was still alive. Second, he was no longer in the gateway that connected the human world and Soul Society. Finally, his hand looked completely normal, with no traces of charred flesh to be found. Groaning as a dull pain filled his body, he shifted himself into a seating position, and took a moment to look himself over. His upper body was still bare, but unlike his hands, there were a few scrapes littering his forearms and chest, along with part of his ribs, and if the pain he felt on his back was any indicator, his back as well. Ignoring the pain for the time being, he glanced around taking in the new environment. All around him he could see nothing but trees. He could hear singing from the birds above, and the rustling of the leaves as a cool breeze penetrated the surrounding area. With a grunt, he dusted his bottom half off and picked up his Zanpakuto which had been embedded into a nearby tree. Resting Zangetsu on his shoulder, the man leaped up onto the nearest branch and then the next, until he reached the peak of the tallest tree he could find. He clearly been spit out somewhere, and to his knowledge, neither Soul Society nor Karakura had a forest that was this large nearby. Making it to the top of the tree, Ichigo's confusion grew when he realized he had no idea what he was looking at. Below him was a sea of trees stretching out for miles, and in the distance, only a relatively small patch was cleared out. He could make out an old-looking building resembling one of the many shrines that littered Japan, but other than that it looked more like an updated version of a section of the Rakongai. "Alright, calm down and think," he said to himself, trying not to panic. "Time passes by differently, and did I get sent somewhere into the future?" He asked out loud before shaking his head. "No, that can't be right. When we saved, we ended up arriving earlier than we had expected." He pinched the bridge of his nose and felt a headache coming on. He glanced up at the nearby town and hopped off the tree. There was only one way to know where he was, and that was to make his way into town and hope he recognized something. Landing on the ground with a soft thud, Ichigo felt the breeze on his upper half and frowned. He'd need to find a new set of clothes, as he couldn't go around shirtless everywhere he went. Sighing, he began the small journey to the town up ahead, hoping for the best. The walk didn't provide any sort of hints as to where he might be. It was all just trees for a large part of the journey, until he made it to the dirt path that led to the entrance of the town. There was a large gate at the entrance with a large nameplate at the very top. It somewhat reminded him of the large sign above Kakaku's house, just without the large hands on the sides. Mujincho is the kanji at the top. While it was good to have a name, he didn't recognize it. It couldn't have been in Tokyo, as it seemed like a very old school city. Maybe he did get tossed somewhere in time and ended up in Kyoto. With still no answers to his questions, he made his way inside and took note of everything. Apart from the area, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. People were going about their day, setting up their shops, and others walking about entering loud establishments. "Well, they're advanced enough to have some sort of gambling hall," he muttered. He could hear people yelling both in triumph and disappointment from within the building. Continuing his walk, he ignored the looks he was receiving, instead focusing his attention on the shops. He could read what each shop sold, but it was the prices that alarmed him. Not the amount themselves, but rather the currency accepted. The shops advertised low-price items for only a handful of ryo. He knew Japan used to use ryo back in the day, but the ones here didn't look like the ones he saw in the history books at school. The currency resembled modern-day yen coins and bills from what he could make out as he passed the stands. "I don't have money on me, and even if I did, it would be worthless here," he thought with a grimace. The only good news was that now he knew he couldn't be in Japan nor anywhere in Soul Society for certain. The bad news was, now he didn't know where the hell he could be. His eyes counted the amount of people walking in front of them, some seemingly better off than others. He now found himself in a delicate situation. There were plenty of ways to get information, none better than simply listening to the locals. This seemed to be some sort of vacation-style town, meant to attract the populace. That meant there'd be people from all walks of life, in other words, valuable sources of information. Noting that there was no one behind him, he looked forward at the people walking ahead of him, and mentally apologized for the inconvenience he was about to cause them. Taking a deep breath, he disappeared from his spot in a burst of speed. Moving in a zigzag pattern along the road, his hands stealthily reached into people's pockets, pulling out bills and coins as quickly and gently as he could. He covered the entire street in a fraction of a second, and hid himself away in a nearby alley, keeping himself pressed against the wall. In his hand were a handful of green bills that closely resembled the ones used in the early 90s. He had denominations of 200 yen coins ranging from 5 to 100. He wasn't sure if it was a lot, but it was certainly more than he came with. Stuffing them into his pocket, he walked down an adjacent street until he found a clothing store. The door chimed as the wood collided with small hanging beads, alerting the shopkeeper that someone had arrived. An old man sat behind a wooden desk, a bored look on his face that soon changed when he saw Ichigo. "I don't know how much you've had to drink, kid, but you need a shirt to be in here." "Beat it," he said in a gruff tone. Ichigo frowned but didn't give a snarky answer in return. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the wad of bills he'd relieved the tourists of, and flashed them back and forth. "Had a bit of a run-in with some people, and unfortunately my shirt didn't make it. I figured I might as well stop and get a new one here," he said, fabricating his story on the spot. Shrugging, he turned around, letting the wound on his back be seen. "But if you don't want the business, that's fine with me." The substitute didn't even get the chance to take a step before the shopkeeper called for him to wait. Smirking in satisfaction, he quickly wiped the look off his face before turning around with a similar bored expression on his face. "Yeah, if you were attacked by shinobi, it's a different story. I thought you had just had too much to drink. Go ahead and pick out what you want," he replied in a somewhat apologetic tone. "Thanks, shinobi," he wondered curiously as he walked through the many racks of clothing. His eyes locked onto what seemed to be dojo-style clothing, which included the top and bottom halves of Kokogi. They even had a set in black, which was almost exactly what he needed. Inspecting the material, his mind wandered back to what the shopkeeper had said. He assumed he'd been attacked by shinobi, which made no sense to him. Grabbing the articles he needed, he made his way back to the counter and placed them down to check out. "So you guys have a shinobi problem around here?" He asked casually, fishing for information. The old man shook his head. Sort of. Rogue low-level shinobi from neighboring villages sometimes prey on tourists who get lost. Anyways, that'll be 800 ryo. Placing the exact amount on the table, he took the clothing and threw it on, securing it with the white fabric that came with it. Okay, so rather than shinigami, I'm dealing with shinobi. He mentioned they're from villages. That means no matter where I go, they'll most likely be the driving military force. He deduced. Walking down the street, he nodded at some people who made eye contact with him and continued forward. Sniffing twice, he followed the scent of miso soup to a small restaurant down the road. Pushing aside the small flaps that fell from the doorway, he caught the attention of a young woman who quickly stopped in front of him. Good morning. She greeted me happily. Just one. He nodded. Perfect, right this way. He was led to a small countertop on the left side of the room, right next to a small group of men who by the looks of things, had been drinking for a while now. Thanking her, he placed Sanjutsu down in between his legs and sat down. A small cup of water was placed in front of him, and after ordering the daily special, he rested his elbow on the counter, and used his hand to support his head. While it might look like he was resting, his ears were carefully listening to any and all chatter. I think we should visit Yugakure next. He heard from somewhere behind him. He made a mental note to remember that name in case it was important and continued listening. I've heard their hot springs are incredible, and since they don't have a shinobi force anymore, we're less likely to be bothered. A village without a form of protection. He wasn't from here, and he knew that couldn't be a good idea. Yeah, that's okay with me. He heard a male voice reply to the woman. From there we can finally get to Konoha. Konoha? Was that another tourist village? He wondered. The sound of a plate being placed in front of him broke his musings. The young woman had returned with his food already. Thank you. Taking a careful sip of the broth, he savored it and couldn't help but nod. It wasn't half bad. While eating, his mind was still reeling from what was happening and everything he'd learned so far. Wherever he was, ninjas seemed to be the military force, but it was clear not every village utilized them. The old man had said the word rogue, meaning they had likely abandoned their village and were off doing their own thing. It was unlikely that the city he was in had shinobi, as it seemed to be a tourist attraction more than anything else. Tapping the wooden surface with his fingers in a rhythmic fashion, Ichigo pondered his next move. He'd gotten this much information, but now what? Think Ichigo, what would Ashita do right now? He questioned himself. The image of the well-groomed Quincy appeared in his mind, pushing up his glasses in his usual condescending way. I'd see if there was a library to gather more information. The mental version of Uryu stated as a matter of fact. The tapping stopped. A library would surely tell him everything he needed. With a course of action in mind, he finished eating quickly and went to pay for the meal. The same young woman who had led him to his seat smiled. Well, what did you think? It was good, the best I've had. He replied. Perfect, that's what we aim for here. 400 ryo please. Dropping the coins in the small tray laid out, he watched her fetch the change and took the opportunity to ask. You wouldn't happen to know where I can find a library or a bookstore around here, would you? I'm on vacation and my little sister asked me to see if I could find something specific for her. He asked as genuinely as he could. The young woman nodded and pointed outward. Yeah, if you go down the street, make a right just past the gambling hall. There's a big building that says books on the door. Anyone's free to walk in, but I don't know if they'll sell any of the books. She said apologetically. No worries. I'll figure it out once I'm there. Take care. He said, waving over his shoulder as he made his way out. Following her directions, he kept his eyes peeled, looking for the building in question. Wherever he was, they seemed to use the same language, so finding the library shouldn't be too hard. With a burst of shunpo, he made it to the exact point the girl had said, and just as she told him, there was a rather large tan building with the simple kanji for book on both of its blue doors. Walking up the steps, he pushed the doors open and took a look around the large room. It was a two-story building with light green tiled floors, tall brown shelves spaced far apart, and a second story with more of the same brown shelves. Quietly walking to the librarian, who was oddly enough writing on a scroll, he cleared his throat. The elderly lady looked up and gave him a warm smile before responding in a subdued tone. Welcome, young man. Is there something specific you're looking for? Where can I find geography and history books? He asked. The old woman stood up and turned 180 degrees before pointing upwards towards a brown shelf on the second floor. Right up on that shelf just to the right of the stairs. Geography is on one side, and history on the other. I'm not sure if you're looking for a specific book, but if you are and can't find it, come ask. Nodding, he made his way towards the stairset and began his ascension. On the second floor were a few empty wooden tables for people to read at. White signs on the wooden shelves gave the names of the section he was in, and with a few more steps, he stopped at the geography section. Crouching down, his eyes scanned the spines of the books on display, hoping to find one that could shed some light on these villages. His index finger ran horizontally across a number of books until he came upon one that caught his attention. Geography of the World. The title was in large bold letters with the background showing a mountaintop. It wasn't much to look at, but it would definitely shed some light on what Yugakure and Konoha were. Stepping to the other side of the bookshelf, he was met with much more books, all detailing some sort of history. Most made no sense to him, but like the geography book, two specifically caught his eye. History of the hidden villages in Chakra through the ages. Grabbing the blue and black books, he took his selections to the small table and began with geography. He didn't have to turn many pages before the world seemed to stand still. The map he was looking at didn't resemble anything on the globe he was familiar with. There was no Japan, no UK, no America. Instead, a massive landmass with a few islands along the coast took his place. The map was labeled, with the largest or most influential being bolded. The big five that stood out to him were the hidden stone, mist, leaf, sand, and cloud. In between them were a few other hidden villages, one of which was Ichigo. Rubbing his now sweating hands along his pants, he turned the page and began reading as much as he could. The book didn't offer much other than the environmental factors and plant life of the villages, but it did paint a bigger picture of where he was. Currently, he was far west in what was known as Fire Country. The area was known for its luscious forests and great weather. That explains the forest I woke up in, he thought to himself. Closing the book, he rubbed his brow and took a deep breath before pushing the book aside. Cracking open the history book, he scanned page by page, absorbing as much as he could. What he found left him dumbfounded. His deduction about the military had been correct. Most hidden villages employed their own shinobi, which served as their primary defense force. Each major village had a Kage which basically acted as the ruler of the village and commander of their forces. Konoha was the first major village, created by two men named Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha. According to the book, there were two of the strongest shinobi in recorded history, one with the ability known as Milkujin and the other with incredible ocular power known as the Sharingan. Okay, so rather than Zanpakuto, these people use chakra, which is a combination of spiritual and physical energy, he thought. That explained why everyone was able to see him despite being in spirit form. Continuing his studies, he found that while some villages were allied, some were still in conflict with each other, and battles between villages weren't so uncommon. Flipping the page, he looked for the history of Ichigo and grinned at what he saw. They had abolished their shinobi forces. A story began forming in his mind just in case he ever needed to identify himself, and Ichigo would be the perfect cover for him. After 3 hours of reading, he shoved the two books aside and began going over the one about chakra. What he learned was fascinating. By all accounts, someone like him shouldn't exist. He had no chakra system or anything vital to life. Now that he thought of it, even the air around here had a slight difference to it. Now that he focused on it, it seemed denser but still light at the same time. Everyone was born with chakra, but not everyone could use it. The people of this world had spiritual and physical energy within them, manifesting in the form of chakra that would power jutsu. In a way, it was similar to as everyone had a certain amount within them. They could even shape it the way his people could. The one difference he saw was that people seemingly had an affinity for an element depending on their chakra, and usually where they were from. Creating dragons out of water and earth were only two of the many examples in which chakra could be used. The basic technique was using it on one's own body to stick to surfaces, a useful ability, but they couldn't walk on the air by creating footstools with chakra, it seemed. The book went into detail about the different types of applications such as ninjutsu, which was elemental-based attacks, genjutsu, which allowed people to cast illusions on others or even inanimate objects. That made him pause for a moment. That meant someone like Aizen could be around as well, though he highly doubted it. Aizen's illusions went far beyond what was described in the book. Genjutsu had counters that were generally known among the shinobi populace. Kyoka Sujutsu was virtually inescapable. Another hour of reading passed before he closed the book and rested his head on his hands, covering his eyes with his palms. The only logical conclusion he could come to was that they had spit him out in a completely new dimension. His fingers gripped his head tightly. It wasn't fair. He'd just gotten his powers back, he'd just gotten the chance to see everyone again, and it had all been taken away. Exhaling, he forced himself to remain calm. His friends knew he would be going, and when he didn't arrive they'd investigate. Urahara would figure something out, he always did. Taking a second to compose himself, he went over everything he'd read. The history books had mentioned something about the 4th Hokage being able to teleport via his signature. It wasn't much to go off of, it was all he had. Maybe visiting Konoha would prove beneficial. He placed the books back in their respective slots and made his way out. The sun was a lot brighter and much higher in the sky than when he'd entered the building. Walking down the steps, he wondered how he would go about entering Konoha. It was considered the strongest of the 5 major villages, and one as strong as that wouldn't simply let him enter with no questions asked. He'd most likely be questioned thoroughly, and while he had his story fabricated, it wasn't solid enough yet. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the few bills he still had on him. Compared to the prices around him, he had enough for a few weeks if he was frugal. Still, if he was stuck here, he might as well be comfortable. Rubbing his chin in thought, he stepped back as 2 women entered his peripheral vision. A bad idea, Lady Tsunade. You already owe a lot of money, you know you have terrible luck. He heard the black-haired woman say. Glancing to the left as they passed, he looked over the two. One was a woman with short black hair and carried a small pig with her. She wore a dark gray robe that was held together by a lavender sash, along with some low heels. The other woman, Tsunade, was a blonde with 2 low pigtails and 2 bangs framing her face. He was reminded of Ranjiku in the sense that she was very well gifted in the chess department. She wore a light gray low-cut shirt that left little to the imagination in regards to her cleavage, and was also held together at the waist by a dark sash. Over that she wore an open green robe with the kanji for gamble on the back. Her pants came down to her calves, and like the other woman, she wore the same style heels. Recognition flashed through his mind as he remembered her name. The history book had mentioned both Hashirama and Tobirama Senju, and also mentioned one living member of their clan named. His head turned towards them, specifically the blonde. She was from Konoha. If anyone could help him, it would be her. He stopped that train of thought a moment later. He couldn't simply go up to her, it would look suspicious. He'd need to be careful about how he approached. She's a chronic gambler. He noted, remembering the other woman's words. If she's here for any reason, it'll be for that. Meaning I'll be able to catch her in the hole. Different world or not, gamblers were the same anywhere. They stay in a casino as long as it took for them to win, and most of the time it took longer than a few hours. Nodding to himself, he turned away towards a nearby inn to book a place for the night and get some rest. XXXX. When night fell on the city, Ichigo emerged from the inn feeling a bit more rejuvenated. He had a few hours to rest and think up a course of action. He recalled that Tsunade was an accomplished medic, one of the best in the world. The fact that he didn't have a chakra system would surely interest her, since he would be an impossibility in the world. He'd rather not reveal that bit of information just yet, but if need be, he would. After all, he was confident in his power. If push came to shove, he was sure he could make it out of a sticky situation. Patting his pocket to make sure the money was there, he walked down to the gambling hall. Stepping inside, he didn't break his stride as he scanned everyone looking for the woman. His eyes quickly fell onto the blonde seated at a card table with 2 of the men and a dealer. Approaching the table, he pulled the vacant seat across from the blonde and tossed some bills on the table. The dealer didn't bat an eye and placed a stack of chips in front of him, before placing 2 cards face up in front of him. So they have this game here too. Ichigo thought, mentally smirking. Contrary to popular belief, he wasn't a delinquent and was relatively gifted in school. Maths to be specific. Putting on a stoic facade, he mentally began doing the maths in his head as he discreetly looked at everyone's cards. As the rounds passed by, Ichigo's stack of chips grew while the others shrank. Tsunade was looking at him with suspicion clear in her eyes, but refused to quit and leave the table like the others had done 10 minutes ago. Tapping the table with a finger, a card was placed in front of him, and then he shook his head. The dealer looked towards Tsunade, who looked at the substitute Shinigami, and then her cards before nodding. The dealer flipped over a card, and Ichigo swore he could hear the woman's teeth gnashing against one another as she went over the target. The dealer flipped over his own card, revealing he too had gone over, and Ichigo was declared the winner. Putting on a fake grin, Ichigo collected the chips and made his way to the area where one would cash out, and pocketed the couple thousand he'd made. Shortly after leaving the area, he could feel 2 presences trailing him. They weren't entirely discreet, but they wouldn't have been picked up on by a normal person. Turning left onto another street, he stopped and turned around. "Can I help you with something?" he called out. A moment later, Tsunade and the young woman with her turned the corner and made their way towards him. The black-haired woman seemed nervous, and he could tell she was apologizing with her eyes. Tsunade on the other hand looked at him with a frown on her face. Stopping a foot away from him, she looked up at him with no fear. "Yeah, you can help me with something. You can start by giving me the money you cheated out of me," she was accused. Pretended to be taken back by the true accusation, he frowned and crossed his arms. "Listen lady, I didn't cheat anyone out of anything. You just can't gamble to save your life," he retorted. The woman next to Tsunade's eyes widened and she began shaking her head frantically. Tsunade smirked at him and stepped closer to him, allowing him to smell the strong scent of sake coming off of her. "Really? Because I've never seen anyone win that much without cheating. You even almost cleared the dealer. So I'll give you one chance to save yourself," she said as she cracked her knuckles. Humming to himself, a light went off in Ichigo's head. The woman was drunk out of her mind and was willing to start a fight in the middle of the street. Maybe he could use this to his advantage. "How about a wager instead?" he replied. Tsunade perked up but soon narrowed her eyes. "Fine, but I'm not gonna let you cheat me here too. I picked the challenge." She shot back, poking him in the chest with a finger. In her mind, she already had the perfect. From looking him over, she couldn't find anything relatively special about him. No overbearing presence like high-level shinobi, nor did he seem like the type to drink regularly to develop resistance. This was her win. No shinobi activities. "Neither of us gets an edge," he countered. She smirked. "Fine. See that bar over there?" she said, nodding towards the lively building down the street. "We're gonna have a drinking contest. I win and you give back all the money you stole from me, plus a little extra for the inconvenience." Ichigo narrowed his own eyes. The woman was clearly drunk, but if she was willing to drink more, that meant she definitely had high resistance to alcohol. He had to stop the Cheshire smirk that threatened to spread across his face at the next thought that popped into his mind. She didn't know he had Zangetsu. Fine, but if I win you take me to Konoha. He shot back, shocking both Tsunade and her companion. A conflicted look passed through Tsunade and for a moment, he thought she'd tell him to get lost, but she didn't. The cocky look she wore soon returned and she huffed, looking away from him. Taking a step forward, she spun him around and grabbed him by the neck, ignoring how high she had to reach to do so. Alright, fine. It's a deal, now come on, I want my money already. She said, leading him in the direction of the bar. Not resisting the hold she had on him, Ichigo let her lead him to their destination. He did however take note of the rather strong grip she had. It wasn't anything he couldn't break out of, but it was certainly something to take note of. Behind them, the black-haired woman and her pig sighed as they were once again dragged into another situation by the older woman. The echo of a shot glass slamming against the counter rang out through the bar, over even the loudest of the patrons within the establishment. Ichigo made a face, not at all enjoying the way the sake, if it could be called that, went down his throat. He was still perfectly coherent, even after 9 shots of alcohol. How does Shunsui drink this on a daily basis? He asked himself. The captain of the 8th division always seemed so tranquil while taking his drink. Though to be fair, he took it out of a small saucer, and probably wasn't meant to get him shit-faced. Shaking his head, he turned over towards the blonde woman who was looking at him through narrowed eyes. Keeping her eyes trained on him, she reached down in front of her where the clear liquid rested in the glass. With a seamless motion gained from years of practice, the legendary shinobi swiped the glass and brought it up to her mouth. In a show of resilience, she swallowed the contents without making a face. That hits the spot, wouldn't you say? She taunted, slamming her glass onto the bar. To say he was rather impressed was an understatement. The woman had clearly been drinking far before he met her at the casino. There were 9 shots into some of the strongest sake the bar had available, and yet she was still able to knock them back. He wondered if maybe this chakra they had within them had anything to do with that. The book hadn't gone into intricate detail on the uses, just the general stuff. The hypothesis forming in his mind shattered the moment he took another look at his opponent. That last drink must have pushed her over a threshold, because her cheeks were now stained red, and her body was slightly more forward onto the bar's counter than before. Of course his eyes couldn't help but dip downwards. The shirt she wore all but displayed her cleavage, and even he couldn't help but notice as they momentarily rested on the countertop. Tsunade either ignored his stare or didn't notice in favor of tapping the bar with 2 fingers quickly, alerting the bartender to continue bringing the rounds as he had been. The man walked over, bottle in hand, and poured the drinks once more. A concerned look was painted on his face upon looking at Tsunade. He'd seen plenty of customers drink less and end up in the state she was in. Giving the man an appreciative nod, Ichigo slid his glass in front of him, and Tsunade did the same. Lady Tsunade, this is a bad idea. The black-haired woman whose name he still hadn't gotten spoke. You've drunk far too much. Maybe you should just cut your losses and let it go. People lose money in casinos all the time. She added, trying to be the voice of reason. Quiet Shizun. Tsunade barked quickly. We're almost done, a few more drinks and I'll win, she said confidently. The alcohol was definitely helping her in that regard. Ichigo scoffed in amusement. She was so gone she hadn't noticed he was completely fine. There was no blush on his cheeks from excess alcohol, his speech wasn't slurred in any way, and his posture was as good as when he'd first sat down. Perhaps if she hadn't already drank earlier in the day, she wouldn't have issued this challenge. Tsunade would have also noticed that despite what she believed, he did have an unusual presence. He was a battle-hardened Shinigami who'd fought a transcendent being, and had even become one himself. The alcohol circulating through her system completely blinded her to the subtle differences between him, civilians, and even shinobi. You're on your last legs already, Ichigo pointed out. Are you sure you don't want to just let it go? I'll accept an apology and we can move out, he offered, knowing a woman like her wouldn't swallow her pride and quit. To prove his point, Tsunade grabbed her shot glass and lifted it up to her hips. Her head tilted back, as did her body as she forced the contents down. Her hand gripped onto the countertop as she felt herself going too far back. Her head swayed for a second, and he was sure if he could see through her eyes, he would probably see double of everything. Your turn, kid, she said in a triumphant tone. Kid? Ichigo mocked, taking hold of his glass. You're what, like 10 years older than me at most? He asked, not expecting a reply. Taking the shot, he missed the pleased smirk that had appeared on the drunk woman's face regarding his comment. Tsunade wasn't sure if he was trying to win points in her book or not, but regardless, he'd gotten them. The pattern repeated a few more times until the bartender came back to fill up shot number 15, and opened another bottle in case more was needed. Tsunade took the initiative this time, and was quick to drink her portion of alcohol. She took a moment to take a few deep breaths before looking over at her drinking partner for the night. She watched him take the shot, grimacing as he did so, and she couldn't help but chuckle at the sight. He was clearly not a lightweight if he was able to go shot for shot with her, but he certainly wasn't a heavy drinker, otherwise he wouldn't have that reaction. Okay, I'll admit, you're doing better than I thought, she said with a bit of a slur in her words. She could still communicate, but some of her words dragged on, and her eyes couldn't stay completely locked on his like when the challenge had been issued. "What's your name anyway?" she asked curiously. For a moment, he wondered whether or not he should give her a false name, but soon realized it would be pointless to do so. He would need to remember the name given and make sure to react accordingly when called. It didn't matter if she knew his real name or not, since he technically didn't exist in this world. There were no records of him anywhere that someone could use to get info about him. "Kurosaki Ichigo," he replied honestly. Tsunade blinked and tilted her head slightly. The name sounded familiar to her, but she couldn't pinpoint where she'd heard it. Having lived and traveled as long as she had, she of course ran into and had heard of quite a number of shinobi. The name Kurosaki however brought her to a momentary pause, as she could swear she'd heard that name before. "You're from Kiri?" she asked after a moment of thought. Thanking the bartender for placing yet another round in front of them, she rested an elbow on the counter to keep her balance, and turned her body a tad bit to look at him. Ichigo shook his head and mentally congratulated himself on how he'd handled things so far. The trip to the library had been well worth it now that he was being asked questions about himself. Before he was given the opportunity to answer, the black-haired woman, Shizun, replied, "You're thinking of Kurosaki Raiga, he's from Kiri. To our knowledge he doesn't seem to have any siblings, at least that's what his bingo book entry says," she informed the older woman. "Oh?" Tsunade said before shrugging. "Almost the same." Ichigo made a mental note of both Kurosaki Raiga and the bingo book Shizun had mentioned. He doubted that this Kurosaki person would be of any interest to him or yield any interesting information, but it wouldn't hurt to look into. If there was information on people in this book, he figured it must be some sort of bounty list. Considering that he was dealing with shinobi, it was the most probable answer. "Maybe I can get my hands on one, see who to potentially worry about while I'm here," he thought. "Okay, so you're not from Kiri?" Tsunade slurred. "You know me and where I'm from, but where are you from? You clearly have some sort of training, or you wouldn't carry that giant blade with you. I don't see a headband on you though, or anything that identifies your village," she pointed out. The substitute Shinigami was amazed that she could point that out in the state she was in. As he was about to answer, he noticed a very slight shift in Shizun's posture on the stool next to Tsunade. While the big-breasted woman might not be in the best state, the other was in prime form to listen in and absorb any information that she could get. Even as she slowly sipped on her own drink and wasn't even looking in their direction, he knew she was listening. If Tsunade missed anything, she would easily be able to fill her in on any information she deemed important. "You won't either," he replied casually. "I'm from Yugakure." Tsunade blinked, not having expected that answer. "Yugakure? I thought they didn't bother trying to produce shinobi anymore," she said in a confused tone. "They don't," he confirmed with a small shrug of his own. "But that doesn't mean that some people don't train. It's common these days to train yourself and then leave the village to become a mercenary. Not everyone was happy with the decision to abolish the shinobi system." He lied. He didn't know if that was true or not, but there was no real way for someone to verify or refute his claim. "Like you?" she asked. To her annoyance, he didn't answer and chose to shoot her a knowing smirk. Instead, he tapped the counter of the bar and requested the next round of drinks. As requested, the clear liquid was poured once again. This time, he took initiative and downed the drink first before turning to look at her. Tsunade looked down at the shot glass in front of her, and she prepared herself by taking a deep breath and inhaling. She was well past her limit, but her actions had gotten her into this mess and she wouldn't back out now. She was fully aware of the man's eyes on her, waiting for her to drink so they could get the next round going. Her stomach churned at the thought of another drink, but she was certain he should be approaching his limit as well, even if he didn't show it. Ichigo watched as she had a mental debate about something, the shot glass just a centimeter away from her lips. He wet his lips subconsciously as the glass touched her mouth, and the liquid began to disappear. Her hand slumped down onto the bar, and her body swayed forward before pulling back. This happened 2 times. On both occasions he found his body wanting to move in case she fell back. Even though the headstrong woman had forcibly dragged him here in a drunken stupor, he would still make sure she wasn't injured in any way if he could help it. As he went to tap her shoulder to make sure she was still with him, her body slumped forward. Her upper body rested on the counter, her eyes closed and breathing steady. Silence overtook the bar until a moment later when loud cheering began. Looking behind them, Ichigo was surprised to see just how large of a crowd had gathered to watch their little competition. Taking a deep breath of his own, he smiled at the victory he'd achieved. Finally, it had ended. It wasn't like he was at risk of getting drunk or anything like that, but that didn't mean he wasn't glad to finally stop drinking something that continuously burned his throat. "Lady Tsunade, are you alright?" Shizun asked, trying to wake the woman up. She shoved lightly, doing her best to wake her from her seemingly deep slumber to no avail. The blonde's body just shook lightly with every small push, but there was no indication that she would be waking up. The only thing she succeeded in was making Tsunade turn her head in her direction, though her eyes were still clamped shut. Walking over to Shizun's side, Ichigo crouched down until he was at eye level with the woman, and waved a hand in front of her face. "Tsunade," he tried with a stern tone. "Nothing. Will she be alright?" he asked Shizune. The woman sighed and pinched her nose before nodding. Yeah, she'll be fine. Physically at least. Once she realizes she lost, that's when I'm not so sure. The main issue now is that I have to carry her back to the inn. She huffed. Do you need a hand? He offered. I'm not exactly sure how you would get her there while also holding a pig, he said, a bit curious as to how exactly she came to have a pig as a pet. She seemed to think it over for a moment, glancing at him and the down form of her master. After a minute of thought she nodded. If it isn't too much trouble. I'm sorry she dragged you into this, and now you need to help get her out of here too, she said with a small bow. Don't worry about it. So what inn are you two staying at? He asked. Shizune opened her mouth to reply, but stopped when the bartender tapped the counter, making them turn to look at him. He had his arms crossed and an expectant look on his face. Stepping aside, he let the two see the 4 empty bottles that were lined up. I know you're not planning to leave without paying for the drinks, he said in a stern tone. You two almost depleted my best sake. I'm only down to 1 bottle now. Ichigo looked over at the slumped form of Tsunade and frowned. His eyes must have been playing tricks on him because he was sure that for a fraction of a second he saw the woman smirk. There's no way she played me, he thought to himself. With a resigned sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the necessary amount to cover the charges. Had he not scored big at the casino, he wasn't sure how he'd pay things off. Shizune shot him a nervous smile, knowing that he had gotten screwed over in this deal. Shaking his head, he sat her up and let her back rest on one arm, while he swooped her legs up in the other. Now having her in a bridal carry, he nodded at Shizune, who led him out the door and down the street. I know it's a bit late and you already know my name, but I never introduced myself. Shizune, she said in a polite tone. Well, I'm sure you were listening anyway, but Kurosaki Ichigo. Feel free to just call me Ichigo though. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's right in this building over here. Luckily our room is on the first floor, so we don't need to go up any stairs, Shizune commented as they approached the inn they were staying at. It was only 2 streets away from him thankfully, so he wouldn't have to walk much. Following her to the room, he carefully placed Tsunade on the bed then allowed Shizune to handle taking her shoes off. Rolling his shoulders to relieve some slight stiffness, he turned to Shizune with a serious look on his face. I know it wasn't you I made the bet with, but regarding the terms, he began. A troubled look flashed through Shizune's face, and Ichigo noted this was the second time it had happened. Whatever it was about Konoha clearly wasn't sitting well for one of both of them, and he couldn't help but wonder what the story there was. I'll remind her about it tomorrow. With how much she drank today, she should be up around noon. Can you meet us in front of the building at that time? She asked. Not having much of a choice, he agreed. Bidding them a good night, he made his way out and towards his own inn. The amount of people on the street had died down, meaning he was free to use shunpo to quickly cross the distance. Thanking the woman working the counter, he headed up 2 flights of stairs to his temporary room, and placed Zangetsu up against the wall next to his bed, before allowing himself to fall on the mattress. The room was quiet, the only sound making its way into his ears came from the soft ticks of the clock next to the bed. He completed his first full day, and now that he had some time to himself, his mind began to wander again. How were things going back home? Had they noticed he was missing? Had any time passed or had too much time passed? They had a strange way of messing with time after all. Undoing the sash that held the shirt together, he removed both shirts and sighed in content at the feeling of the fresh sheets on his bare back. There was still slight pain in his back, as well as his arms from the wounds he'd received, but those were the least of his worries for now. Placing his arms behind his head, he stared at the white ceiling above him, and planned out his moves for tomorrow. The bingo book Shizune had mentioned was definitely something worth looking into. He was in a tourist-type town, so he doubted they'd have one, but it wouldn't hurt to check the library. From what Shizune said, it seemed Tsunade would be out for the count until midday, meaning he had plenty of time to do a little research before then. I'll hit the library first and go from there. Worst case scenario, I'll have to ask around to see if anyone knows anything, he muttered to himself. A yawn escaped him, reminding him just how tired he actually was. Turning off the light, he pulled the blanket over him and rolled onto his side. I'll get back home, everyone. Even if it takes a while, I promise I'll see you all again, he thought to himself before closing his eyes and drifting off to sleep. The next morning he awoke just as the sun was barely rising over the horizon. Settling into a sitting position, he raised his arms over his head and stretched, going left to right. Ate him, he noted, looking at the clock. He noted he still had 4 hours before he had to meet with Tsunade and Shizune. Plenty of time to hit the library and see if they had what he needed. He walked to the small bathroom provided and took a quick shower. 25 minutes later, he made his way out of the inn and walked back to the library. Thankfully, he arrived just as the librarian seemed to be unlocking the doors. Good morning, young man, she greeted me. Am I to assume you're looking for more geography and history books? She asked. He shook his head, though he was kind of surprised that she remembered exactly what he'd asked for. Actually, I was wondering if the library had any bingo books available. The woman unlocked the door and pushed it open, holding the door for him to enter. I believe we have one, but it probably won't be of much use to you. It's a book from well over 2 years ago. Most of the bounties in that book have most likely already been claimed. She told him as he walked through the doors. If you still wish to see it, I could fetch it for you. He declined politely. Outdated information would be as beneficial as no information. Do you know where I could get my hands on one? To his surprise, she nodded. You can get them at most bounty stations, though keep in mind it'll cost you a bit. She informed him. That wasn't a problem, he still had plenty of winnings from his streak the night prior. From what I've heard from some rowdy men around town over the years, there's 2 bounty stations near us. The first is west of town, follow the path, and you'll eventually see a lone building seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The second is to the east, located in a grassy plain, but I'm not too sure where exactly. I just know it's a bit more hidden than the first one. Wessa, he muttered. Thanking her for the information, he asked for a pen and paper before picking up a map of the area nearby. Taking notes of where he would need to go, he wrote down some notes before closing the book and folding the paper before stuffing it in his pocket. Leaving the building, he made his way to the front gate of the city and turned west. Looking up at the still rising sky, he stretched his legs for a minute before disappearing. A small dent in the ground appeared from the force of his movements, along with a distinct noise indicating high-speed movement. The area passed by him in a blur. While he wasn't in Bankai form where he would be traveling even faster, he was still moving at speeds most people would have trouble registering. Trees followed by momentary lapses of open space flashed through his eyes for a few seconds, until he came to a stop atop a large tree branch overlooking a mostly empty plain. The road continued going straight, and if he recalled the map correctly, it would lead towards Kusagakure. Just off the path, visible due to his altitude, was a large non-labeled building that seemed strangely out of place. That has to be it, he thought. Hopping off the tree, landing with little more than a thud, he moved off the path and towards the building. There were no signs indicating that anything specific was taking place, and to a degree it made sense. If there was a large sign, enemies could simply camp out and wait on targets. Heading inside, he noted the lack of any people, but he could definitely feel that there were people present. Glancing downward, his head moved to the right to see a stone statue of some sort of warrior. On the other side of the room, a similar statue was placed, though that one wasn't directly in line with the first. Raising an eyebrow, he easily slid the statue across the ground, revealing a passageway behind it. You gotta be kidding me, he muttered to himself. It felt like he was getting involved in a shady drug business like he'd seen in the movies back home. Walking down the flight of stairs, he finally heard footsteps walking around along with a gruff voice muttering something. His hand was ready to draw Zangetsu at any moment, even though his body seemed completely relaxed. He'd rather not destroy the building, but if his first encounter with someone outside the town was anything less than amicable, it probably wouldn't be avoided. The sound of his footsteps ceased all activity in the room below. Glancing around, he noticed it looked a lot like a morgue with multiple square slots along the walls. Some were closed and some were open, revealing an empty compartment. You're a new face. Ichigo turned his attention to a man wearing a long white coat with a high collar that covered the bottom half of his mouth. He had slicked back black hair and a cut underneath one of his eyes. And you don't seem to have a body with you, he noted, his tone turning slightly suspicious. Raising his hands in mock surrender, he stopped in his place, far enough away to show he wasn't there for any nefarious reason. No, I don't. I'm in the market for a bingo book. They don't exactly give them out in Yugakure anymore. The man gained a look of understanding and nodded slowly. I see. I understand your village did away with their shinobi. Ichigo didn't reply. It was known what they'd done, there was no need to confirm. Well, no matter what the man replied, walking over to the other side of the room where a small metal cabinet was located. Opening up the bottom drawer, he pulled out a small but thick black book and held it up. It just so happens I happen to have a few in stock at the moment, he said. Ichigo noted his tone changed to that of a salesman. I'm sure you know every village has its own iteration of the bingo book, detailing thereafter. But some bounty stations do things just a little differently. He trailed off, making sure he had the young man's attention. You tell? He asked in a full sport tone. This one happens to have almost every target from every village. It's not limited to say Hakuma once at the moment. Understand? I do. I also understand something like this is valuable for bounty hunters, because it offers much more targets than a standard one from a hidden village. Ichigo replied. So how much are you asking? The man smirked, glad that he wasn't dealing with an idiot like the last person from Yugakure. 10,000 ryo. A bargain, I would say. Ichigo wasn't sure if that was a bargain or if he was being ripped off, but there wasn't much of a choice. Part of him wanted to negotiate, but the other part told him not to bother. It wasn't like he needed the money for anything important. If everything worked itself out, he'd be heading home soon. Fine. Pulling out a handful of bills, he counted them out loud and handed them over. The man's hand gripped the bills, but they wouldn't budge from the Shinigami's grip. Extending his other hand, Ichigo uttered one word. Book. The man placed the bingo book in his grip, and only then were the bills released. The book was described with the first few pages pertaining to targets wanted by Konoha and the next by Kumo and so on. Also, before I forget, the man said, getting his attention. He rustled through another drawer and pulled out a long bit of fabric and tossed it his way. His right hand shot out, catching the strangely heavy piece of cloth out of the air. Breaking his gaze away from the book, he frowned at the feeling of a metal plate that seemed to be on the opposite side of the cloth. Turning the black fabric around, he stared at the metal plate that seemed to be riveted on. There were 3 diagonal lines in the center of the plate, but nothing else. Remembering that each village had its own insignia, he quickly deduced what village this headband belonged to. I didn't see one of you and I've had that lying around here for a while. Seems like Ichigo didn't really produce much talent, did it? He asked. Had Ichigo really been from the hot spring village, perhaps he'd have taken offense to that. Shrugging, he stuffed the headband in his pocket and made his way back up the stairs. The entire exchange had only taken a handful of minutes, meaning he could get back and see who was who in this world. XXXX. By the time he made it back to his room, the clock had barely struck 9. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, he opened the book and began going page by page, seeing if there were any people of interest. After all, worst case scenario and Konoha was a bust, he could at least make a living as a bounty hunter while planning his next move. Opening the bingo book, the first thing he noted was the picture of a rather bland-looking man, along with 2 smaller images of him to the left. His name was displayed on the upper left-hand corner of the photo, and below it was his rank, which he figured was measured from ES, followed by the amount they were valued at by which village. Some he noted had multiple values if different villages had that person as a target as well. It took more than 15 pages before one finally caught his attention. It was a man in a sleeveless green vest, gray hair along with a headband that had been pulled down to cover his left eye. A mask covered the bottom half of his face, combining that with the headband, only his right eye was visible. The copy ninja had a Kakashi, he read out loud before whistling. A rank shinobi worth 76 million ryo dead or alive by Kiri, Kumo, Suna, and Iwa. So far that had been the highest bounty he'd come across. The bingo book didn't go into much detail, only giving the basic information. He did partially wonder what the man had done to make people mad enough to put almost 100 million on his head. The next entry that intrigued him came 2 pages later. Staring back at him was the image of the youngest one yet. The man seemed to be his age with prominent stress lines on his face. He had black hair with 2 bangs framing his face and deep black eyes. Ichigo Tachi. S-rank terrorist wanted by Konoha for 150 million ryo. Damn. He really wished to give something of a description of what they were capable of, but he supposed if they were as infamous as this, perhaps it would have been known by people already. Checking the time again, he stopped as an image of Tsunade popped into his mind. Glancing back down at the book, he began flipping through the pages. His eyes moved left to right rapidly, inspecting the photos until he found the one he was looking for. In the Iwagakure section of the book was a picture of the woman he'd beaten in a drinking contest. Her picture was slightly different from the woman he'd interacted with last night, however. Like Kakashi, she wore the same style headband over her forehead, and had a gray vest covering her upper half. She stared at the camera with emotionless eyes, a contrast to the cocky, challenging look he'd seen her wear. Senju Tsunade, the best medic in the world. That made his eyebrows raise in surprise. All he'd seen of her was that she was a terrible gambler, and likely had a case of alcoholism. S-rank shinobi were wanted alive by Iwa, with a bounty of 200 million, so she was a big shot around here for reasons other than her name. He'd of course seen a mention of her in the history book, but this new information made him see her in a different light. It also brought up the question, what was the world's best medic doing in this town gambling and getting drunk? He wasn't a nosy person, but he couldn't say he wasn't interested in the story there. Closing the book, he placed it next to him on the bed and let himself fall back. If she was from Konoha, then she'd have no reason to be out gambling. He highly doubted their military allowed their subordinates to simply leave the village for leisure as they pleased. Unless she had done just that, he thought. If she had left the village, it could explain why the 2 women looked troubled at the stakes of the wager. Standing up, he pulled all the bills out of his pocket and removed 5 from the stack. Using the Yukikure headband he'd been given, he used it as a makeshift rubber band to keep the stack of bills compact. Not having eaten yet, he decided to grab a bite and wait for his meeting, though not before adjusting the blade on his back and putting the book away in his free pocket. By the time noon rolled around, he was already leaning against the wall next to the entrance of the inn. For a moment he wondered if they'd left already, and had simply given the time frame as an excuse so they could leave town, but his worries were for naught. Shizune and a very stoic-looking Tsunade exited the building a moment after the thought passed through his mind. "Morning," he said plainly. "Good morning, Ichigo," Shizune replied with a slight bow. Tsunade mumbled a good morning and crossed her arms over her ample chest, looking elsewhere but him. "Alright, here's the deal, I have a few things to do in a couple more towns. If you want to go to Konoha, that's fine," she said, giving Shizune a look. "However, I do need to take care of my business first. So, you can either wait in this town for a couple of months, and we'll come get you when it's time, or you can come with us," she proposed. Ichigo mentally hummed, he should have known it wouldn't be that easy. Whatever issues she had with Konoha were clearly deep enough for her to not want to go back. The look she had sent Shizune also gave him the impression that she had potentially talked her into honoring their agreement. Now he could decline and go on his own, but that would lead to issues for sure. If he went and Tsunade sent word, even if she was on bad terms, they'd believe he was from Yugakure. A member of a foreign village wanting to enter for unknown reasons was ample reason for them to interrogate. The second option was to wait it out with them and eventually gain access through Tsunade. She was an important person in the world. If he showed up with her, the chances of things going wrong decreased dramatically. Fine, I guess I'm tagging along, he said plainly. Shizune nodded happily while Tsunade huffed and replied, fine. Do you have everything you need? We're leaving. Lead the way. The trio walked towards the entry of the city and walked down the path, only this time it was in the opposite direction that he'd gone earlier that morning. He wasn't sure where they were going, nor did he really care. He was playing a waiting game now. He had endured 17 months without power, he could endure a few here. Trying to see things in a positive light, not many got the opportunity to see a new world. He'd be able to see how the people lived, and maybe he'd get lucky enough to figure out the mystery that was Tsunade. Nothing but trees had been seen on either side of him as he walked alongside the two ladies. They had only been on the road for about an hour, and without any kind of landmarks, he still had no idea where they were going. He had of course seen the map of the land, but only for a brief moment. It wasn't enough time for him to have a clear picture in his mind about where exactly they were heading. He knew for sure they weren't going in the direction of Kusa, as he'd gone a different route earlier. Though he supposed it really didn't matter. From the brief time spent in the company of Tsunade and Shizune, he'd learned that the black-haired woman often tried to be the voice of reason, only to be ignored. Wherever they were headed, Shizune seemed to be against the idea. As a direct result of her words falling on deaf ears, the debts the busty blonde owed across the land kept piling up higher than the boxes he'd had to stack for Kumi. The thought of debts also brought up a rather important question in his mind. If Tsunade was from such a prominent family within Konoha and was regarded as the best medic in the world, how does she not have money? Ichigo was certain that in the single day he'd spent in the Land of Fire, he already had more money to his name than she did. It just didn't make sense to him. Turning his attention away from the foliage, he turned his attention to the two bickering women, and almost chuckled at the ensuing conversation. It'll be fine, Shizune, it's just a drink or two. She tried reasoning. It's never one or two drinks. She huffed. We only have a little bit of money left, I can't let you go blow it to get drunk again. You drank enough last night, that's why you woke up an hour ago. That caused him to release the chuckle he'd been holding at bay, though he quickly coughed in an attempt to cover it up. Quickly pulling out his bingo book, he began flipping through the pages, opting to read as he knew the eyes were on him. Skipping over the first few that he'd seen, the page landed on a rather interesting individual. Not only him but also another whose image he'd managed to catch while flipping through them. He'd found himself in the Kiri section of the book and was staring at the strangest man he'd seen. Now he wasn't one to judge on appearance, as he'd gotten to know a certain captain who was literally an animal, but this one was different. Hashigaki Kisum, he read mentally. The man had small white eyes and dark blue hair styled upwards. The strangest part, however, were the three lines underneath each eye. They sort of resembled gills. Either they were actually fish gills or were self-made cuts made to resemble them. Of all the things he'd learned of the world so far, finding out that they had fishmen was certainly at the top of the list in terms of surprises. He'd only ever seen something like that in some of the manga he'd read. S-rank criminal wanted dead or alive by Kiri, he continued before turning his attention to the prize for his capture. It was just as high as Ichigo Itachi. Again he wished they would say exactly what he did to warrant such a monetary prize, but didn't dwell on it for long. It wasn't like he was going after him anytime soon, if at all. Flipping through the pages, he stopped at the other that had caught his attention. Compared to Kisum, he looked like a regular guy, at least in terms of physical appearance. His facial expression told a completely different story. This one happened to be from his home village of Yugakure. He was a young man, maybe 3 or so years older than him at most. His silver hair was combed back and wore his headband around his neck. One could vaguely see the handle of some sort of weapon over his right shoulder. He doubted it was a sword of any kid, since there was also a rather thick cable protruding from the end of the handle. Hiding. What do you know about S-class? Either the villages gave S-rank too easily, or it was simply coincidence that the last few he checked out just so happened to be S-rank. The maniacal grin on the man's face radiated madness. In a way it sort of reminded him of Grimmjow and Kenpachi whenever they found someone worth fighting, but hiding was a bit different. At least Kenpachi saved it for the enemies most of the time. With just a simple look, one could tell hiding was unhinged. He'd have to look into him a bit more. As someone from Yugakure, it would stand to reason that he of all people would have at least known or heard of him. Looking at the image again, he chuckled as the comparisons of hiding, Grimmjow, and Kenpachi surfaced again. Something funny, Kurosaki? Tsunade asked. Ichigo controlled himself and shook his head no. Just thinking about something funny, he replied. The woman didn't seem to buy it, but kept quiet and turned her attention back on the path ahead of them. Stuffing her hands in the pockets of her green jacket, Tsunade walked ahead, but made sure to look at him with a suspicious gaze before looking away. He shook his head and looked over at Shizune, who smiled at him and covered her mouth to stifle her own laughter. The pair was sure Tsunade could hear them chuckling, but fortunately, she seemed to let it go and continued walking. Hours of slow-paced walking later, the trio arrived at another town named Nagamitsu. Just like the last one, it seemed to be a hotbed for people looking to win big. Even the sign at the top of the entrance shined in bright flashing lights. Unlike the last area, which seemed to want to draw in tourists with many different attractions, this one seemed to be catered almost specifically to gambling. This caused him to wonder if the entire Land of Fire was like this. If there were towns dedicated to gambling, then it had to mean the act was either illegal in major villages, or at the very least frowned upon. Slowing his step, he maneuvered himself so that he was walking to the right of Shizune. Shizune noticed and looked up at him with a questioning look on her face. What kind of business does she have here exactly? "'Cause I have one guess in mind," he questioned. His tone did little to suppress the suspicion he felt. Hearing the question, both Shizune and Taunton sighed. "Your hunch is right," she confirmed before quickly waving a hand in front of him. "But it's not for pleasure, not completely at least," she said, adding that last part because she knew the statement wasn't completely true. Ichigo stared back at her with a puzzled expression. From what he knew about gamblers, they kept chasing the feeling that came from winning, which was how they got addicted in the first place. It had to be for pleasure. Scooting just a tad bit closer to him, she spoke in a hushed tone. "Lady Tsunade has raked up a lot of debt across the nation, so she goes gambling in the hopes of winning the money back." He finished for her in the same hushed voice. "How much does she owe?" "A lot." The same question he'd been wondering about since he learned if Tsunade came back to the forefront of his mind. "I don't understand though, isn't she a member of the Senju clan?" he asked, glancing over at the woman up ahead to make sure she wasn't looking back. "They should have some money to their name." Shizune once again shook her head. "You would think so, but no, almost all of the money the clan had has been spent." Ichigo wanted to say he couldn't believe it, but he definitely could. The woman was a chronic gambler whether she knew it or not, and a bad one at that. It wouldn't be far-fetched to believe that she had burned through most of it. At the rate they were going, whatever money they had would deplete and she would be in debt once more, then the cycle would repeat. The Shinigami stared at the blonde woman's back, and once again wondered what happened to get her to this point. For a moment he considered asking Shizune, since she seemed to be very close with her, but decided against it. That was something he was sure she wouldn't reveal. If he wanted answers, he'd need to get them from the woman herself. Following her into a small restaurant, the three were seated at a small table with 4 chairs. Shizune sat on one side, while Ichigo and Tsunade sat next to each other on the other. "Alright," Tsunade spoke, getting their attention. "Once we finish sheeting up, we'll be heading out." Their 2 travel companions blinked in surprise, neither having expected those words to come out of her mouth. "We're not staying here?" Ichigo asked slowly. "No," the blonde replied simply. "The real town we're going to is just about an hour away. At the speeds we're going at least." Ichigo looked her in the eyes with a deadpan expression. "Let me guess, another gambling town." The blonde smirked and sat back in her chair. "Look who's catching on. You sure it's a good idea to go to another town to lose more money? You never know if someone might be able to cheat you," he replied with a smirk of his own. As expected, the woman's look disappeared, and a tick mark could be seen appearing on her forehead. Turning to face him, she leaned forward and jabbed his arm with a finger. "I'll have you know I'm going to be on a hot streak soon, I can feel it." Unaffected by her reply, he followed her actions and leaned back in his own chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he did so. "I'm certain I've heard that plenty of times from gamblers, and oddly enough they always end up in a similar situation." He was sure the comment would have gotten under her skin. He even expected some sort of outburst, followed by the 2 childishly bickering, with Shizune trying to control them, but that didn't happen. A proud look crossed her face, but she didn't elaborate on how exactly she planned on winning. "Don't worry about it, just know it'll be different this time. Now let's eat," she said, having already decided on what she wanted to get. Shizune, however, had an idea as to what would be the backbone of her friend's plan. The look Tsunade wore was the same one she herself had seen plenty of times in the past, usually before she was dragged into a new get-money-fast scheme. She felt sorry for the young man as he was already unknowingly a part of Tsunade's plan. Admittedly, if it was what she was thinking, it was one of the better ones this time. He'd proven himself capable of beating a casino, as even the dealers cheat to win. For him to almost clean the house as easily as he had showed that he had some experience with underhanded techniques. Techniques that the blonde would have no problem exploiting for her benefit. The question now would be how he would react to it, and how long it would take for him to be roped in. Ignoring the feeling he got from the look she sent him with regards to her hidden plan, Ichigo took a sip of his water, and turned to look out the front entrance from his seat. "From what I've seen, most of the world resembles old-school Japan," he thought. At first he had figured maybe it was that specific town he'd arrived near. Even back home there were still plenty of towns and villages that kept their historic roots, albeit with some modern amenities. There wasn't too much of a difference, having spent plenty of time in Seoul society, so to a degree he was used to it. It still felt strange knowing that for an unknown amount of time, he'd be without a lot of the things he now realized he took for granted. Things like cars, phones, and television. He'd only been here for a day, so it wasn't too bad, but without a time frame it really got him thinking. Sure, he could live without a car, phone, and TV, but that didn't mean he wouldn't like to enjoy everything once in a while. There was a reason people had mostly stopped sending letters everywhere with the invention of the phone. Here, it seemed that was the main form of communication, that and scrolls. Something on your mind? Ichigo blinked and turned to look at both women who were staring at him. Shizune had a curious look on her face, while Tsunade just had a raised eyebrow. Nothing much, just comparing this place to home. He answered truthfully. Shizune nodded. I've never been to Yugakure, but I can imagine it has to be beautiful, since it's very well known for its hot springs. I've only heard about them but have never seen them myself. Compared to that, I imagine a town like this doesn't really compare. They're both tourist attractions, only Yugakure doesn't prey on people. Tsunade said, sitting up a bit straighter as her food was placed in front of her. Ichigo and Shizune also had their dishes brought out, as well as having some chopsticks laid down next to them. So what was it like over there? Tsunade questioned, taking a bite of her food. Before they got rid of their shinobi. She clarified. Shit. Ichigo thought to himself. He fabricated something of a background for himself, but never ironed out the details. Without panicking, he took a bite of his food and a drink to buy himself just a few more seconds, as his brain began concocting a story. From what he'd read in the history of the chakra, there was a very brief mention of villages teaching how to use it through a shinobi academy. Having that little bit of information in mind, the pieces began assembling themselves. Like any other shinobi village, I assume. He replied casually. I was just finishing the academy when the village made the decision to abolish the military. Some saw it as a good thing since it showed we didn't rely on missions to be self-sustaining. Others, namely the existing shinobi, didn't see it that way. Some were more vocal about their displeasure than others. So you were never a part of a three-man squad? Shizune asked, taking an interest in the conversation. He shook his head. No. The furthest we got was receiving our headbands, and the decision that Yugakure would be a tourist destination had been solidified, and that was that. The academy closed down, and anyone who wasn't already a shinobi would never be one. Tsunade sipped her drink and looked over his upper body. So you graduated and were officially recognized as a shinobi, but they axed you shortly after. That's harsh. So what did you do with your headband? I can't imagine it really means anything to you if you never got the chance to represent it on the field. Two sets of eyes followed his hand as he reached into his pockets and pulled out the wad of money he still had. Their eyes were immediately drawn to the metal plate that showed the symbol of Yugakure. So you did keep it? Shizune commented with a small smile. You told us we wouldn't find anything on you to identify your home village yesterday, but you still carry it around with you because it's special to you. Seeing that he had no answer, Tsunade spoke once more. So you became an official shinobi and then left the village? Not exactly. I became an official shinobi and trained under a few different people for a few years. He continued, mixing in his experiences from back home into the new life he was fabricating. Once I figured I was strong enough, I took my talents onto the field. And so you became a bounty hunter, right? That's why you carry a bingo book with you. Shizune said, putting the pieces together. Something like that, yes. And life outside of the academy? Shizune prodded, trying to learn more about their newest edition. What was there to do on the off days? Not much, honestly. He replied simply before taking another bite of his food. Just hot springs. Tsunade raised an eyebrow at his response. Really? She asked in a skeptical tone. There was nothing to do in the village. He shook his head. When you've been to one hot spring, you've been to them all. That's all we had going for us. The blonde locked eyes with the younger woman, trying to see if she was feeling the same thing she was. With a simple look the message was conveyed and a nod followed. No matter where one was, there was always something to do, even in the smaller villages. Surely there were friends to hang out with, women to go out with, local spots to explore. Something didn't add up. Perhaps she was looking too far into things, but anyone would have things to do in their home village. She left it alone for the time being, but definitely kept it in mind. There was more to him than he let on, and she was now curious as to what that was. After eating their food, making small talk, the trio was back on the road. Unlike when they left the first time, this smaller journey proved to be much more interesting. Within half an hour, the group came to a stop on Tsunade's orders. A moment after stopping, 4 figures appeared in front of them. 3 were dressed similarly in tan one-piece outfits with black X marks going down the center. All 3 had bandages over their eyes, although one had an eye visible, another had both, and the third was completely covered. They also wore something akin to snorkels over their mouths, and had the same headband around their head featuring 4 vertical lines. The fourth was an older man in a similar outfit, although he was all black, and lacked a mouthpiece and blindfold like the others. He was clearly the leader of the group. The man locked eyes with Tsunade, and Ichigo noticed his body tense up. The man's arms extended behind his students, and he took a step forward. Megakure Ichigo thought to himself, recognizing the symbol. Tsunade rolled her eyes and placed a hand on her hip. Relax, we aren't going to attack, she said. You can never be too sure these days. The man replied in a gruff tone. After all, with how Konoha left our village, we can never let our guard down. He added with a bit of resentment. Ichigo raised an eyebrow at the man's words. He quickly went over what he'd read but was coming up blank. At the time he'd been focused on the villages as well as looking for specific information. There was no real info on any major conflicts, but it was clear that Omegakure had some sort of resentment towards Konoha. Tsunade sighed and pinched her nose in frustration. We're not going to attack you. Just take your team and hurry up. I doubt Konoha will allow them entry into the exams if you're late, she said. The sensei of the team walked along the path with carefully placed steps. Every step he took his hand got closer and closer to a pouch that had been strapped to his thigh. Ichigo kept his eyes locked on the man's hand as it hovered over the pouch. If he tried anything, Zangetsu would be swung before anyone even knew what had happened. His hand twitched ever so slightly, an action that was caught by Shizune, but it quickly settled down along his side once the team had passed. Just as quickly as they had arrived, they disappeared. The rustling of the trees overhead told them they had decided to travel by branch at high speeds. His eyes followed the light shaking of the trees down the road until he could no longer see movement and turned to follow the women once again. Gotta make sure to look into whatever happened between Omegakure and Konoha. She mentioned something about exams happening at Konoha too. If shinobi from other villages are allowed entry, then it must be some sort of shinobi evaluation perhaps. He thought to himself. The rest of the trip went off without a hitch. Other than some random traveling merchants, no more surprise guests made themselves known to them. The new town they'd arrived at was even more grandiose than the last one. It seemed if there was one thing some of these towns didn't skimp out on was lighting. Every building was well illuminated with bright lights, describing the various games to be played and prizes to be won. Alright, so what's your brilliant plan to win? Ichigo asked. He should have known something was wrong when Tsunade smiled at him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. Appearing next to him, her arm wrapped around his shoulder, letting it hang idly. The question you should be asking is what's our brilliant plan to win? She said. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. How he didn't see this coming, he would never know. You're gonna be my partner here for a few days. Now come on, we have time for a few games tonight. Just like last time, the woman led him away with her. He supposed it wasn't as bad as being grabbed by the neck and dragged into a bar to have his throat burn. To Shizune's amazement, Tsunade's plan actually worked for the few hours they played that night. Of course Ichigo had to adjust it so that it looked natural. Walk in at different times, signal to each other when stakes are getting high and go in for the kill. By the time they checked into their inn, the two had won a few thousand ryo each. Most of which was won by Ichigo with the occasional lucky win by Tsunade. Unsurprisingly, the blonde was in a much better mood for the rest of the night. The next day operated almost the same, although Ichigo had decided he would skip cheating casinos for the day. The plan was to stick around for a few days, but if they continued winning on a daily basis, eventually they'd piss some people off. He wasn't worried about anyone here, nor did he believe Tsunade or Shizune were either. That didn't mean that he'd welcome problems though. Sitting on the edge of his bed first thing in the morning, Ichigo pulled out the bingo book. Skipping through all of the high-ranking shinobi, he kept his eyes open for some of the lower-level ones. Even though the high B rank all the way to S rank offered a substantial amount, even the C ranks and below offered at least 1 million. That would serve him well for a while as they traveled around. He thought back to the encounter with the shinobi from Omegakure and went to that section in the book. He smiled when he saw the face of a rather blank C rank shinobi, with a couple 100,000 ryo bounty on him by Konoha. That should be more than enough for a little while. Ichigo thought to himself. He's a low-level shinobi on the run, that means he probably wouldn't risk leaving an area he's familiar with. He'll be around the area, it's just a matter of finding where. Tapping the page with the bottom side of a pen that he'd found in the room, he formulated a plan of action. With the speed of his shunpo, he could cover the distance between here and a land of rain within minutes. Depending how cooperative anyone was would determine how long it would take to complete the job. Closing the book, he strapped Zangetsu on his back and left the room, making his way over to the ladies' shared room. Knocking on the door, Shizune answered. Hey Ichigo, did you need something? She asked. Just giving you a heads up, I'll be gone for a few hours. I'm going on a bounty hunt to earn some quick money. He replied. The woman looked interested and asked who he would be going after. Showing her the page in the book, he watched her face change from curious to pensive. Well, from what I know, Omegakure is almost impossible to enter as a foreign shinobi, unless invited for something like the Chunin exams. It looks like Konoha has set the bounty on him, but I'm not sure what for. If he's inside the village, you're out of luck, she informed him. He made note of the information in the book. Either way, it'll be nice to do something other than helping Tsunade gamble. Is she still asleep? He asked curiously. Shizune ruefully shook her head. She woke up a little while ago, and said she would get a head start on the day. I wouldn't doubt it if she lost everything you guys won yesterday. Ichigo stared up at the ceiling of the hallway, and mentally wondered why the one person he needed on his side happened to be a chronic gambler. Alright I'll let her know you'll be gone for a couple days. We will leave without you, don't worry. the black-haired woman promised. Thanking her, he exited the inn and made his way towards the entrance of the town. Using Shunpo, he began his journey towards the Land of Rain. Shizun's words echoed in his mind as he dashed through the area. If the man wasn't in the surrounding area, he would either have to infiltrate the village itself or cut his losses. The man was a C rank, hardly enough of a reason to enter. Plus, if on the off chance he was caught, they'd see the Yugakure headband. Even though they lacked shinobi, they would probably send someone to investigate or attack out of retaliation. Putting innocent people in danger like that was not in his plans. Soon, the sky above him began to change from the clear skies he'd started to get used to the dark gloomy overcast clouds he'd grown to hate over the years. One drop hit him, then two, before a downpour caused him to stop under a large tree. The foliage granted him some cover, though a few drops continued to land on his shoulders and head. Shaking his head to rid himself of the excess water, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He could feel people in the area, not much a few up ahead. A small town, no doubt. With one more Shunpo, he was at the border of the small town. It was the first one that looked different than what he was used to. Compared to the flashy towns he traveled to in the Land of Fire, this one lacked in comparison. A few crudely built homes along what seemed to be a path, and the occasional shop here and there. The few people he did see walking about with umbrellas over their heads lacked the light in their eyes that he'd seen from others. The area was mostly devoid of light, with only a few visible from the small homes, and a decently sized food stand just a bit ahead. Maybe town was being generous. Ichigo thought to himself. Heading to the small food stand, he opened the flaps and walked inside, taking a moment to survey everyone in the area. He wasn't surprised to find that his target wasn't present, although there was someone who looked oddly familiar. Apart from the small tables, there was also a counter situated right in front of the kitchen area, where people could see the chefs cooking. Taking a seat, he selected a warm soup they advertised and waited. There was only one person working, a young man with black hair that wore the same defeated look on his face. He was efficient and had clearly been cooking for a while, as in only 3 minutes, the steaming bowl was placed right in front of him. Muttering a thanks for the meal, he slurped the noodles and nodded in appreciation of the taste. "This is really good," he complimented, making some small talk. "Thanks, I haven't seen you around here," the chef replied. Ichigo shrugged and took down some more noodles. "I wouldn't be around long." Pulling out a few loose bills from his pocket, he folded them up so they would be concealed within his palm. "I do have a question if you don't mind though," he added, placing the folded bills on the countertop. The man's eyes glanced at the bills and knew where this was headed. "You wouldn't happen to know this person, would you?" he asked, flashing the image of the shinobi he was looking for. "You won't find him around here," the man replied, taking the offered money. "He's unnamed, nobody has seen him for a few weeks now. My guess is he's probably dead," he said with an uncaring shrug. Ichigo sighed. "I see," he said. Looking to his right, he noticed a man with greenish hair and an umbrella situated on his back. He was looking down at his food, but Ichigo could tell he was completely focused on him. In the back of his mind, the orange-haired Shinigami once again had the feeling that he'd seen him somewhere. Skipping through the pages of his bingo book, he quickly found out why. The Kusho Hour, he read. C rank, wanted alive by Konoha. 3 million Ryo bounty. Closing the book, he tucked it away and stood up, making a show of doing so. Pulling out the wad of money, he made sure the light reflected off the headband to show the symbol of Yugakure. He knew the other villages would know about the situation, and who would fear someone from a nation without shinobi. Inwardly he smirked when he saw that the man had stood up and made his way out. He could sense that he was still lurking around waiting. He'd taken the bait. Paying for the meal, he made his way out and back the way he came. Eyes were following him, and with every step he took, the distance between him and Rakusho never seemed to close. Once they were far enough out, he stopped and turned around, staring at the empty space in front of him with a bored expression. "Well, are you gonna come out or not?" he called out. A second later, the man materialized in front of him, holding a strange-looking hilt in his hand. "I couldn't help but overhear you back there," he called out. "I'm not sure what you were thinking by coming here, but that mistake will be your last." The crackle of lightning reached his ears, and the hilt began to glow. Suddenly, a large blade of lightning formed at the end of the hilt, and Rakusho's face split into a grin. Reaching upwards, he grabbed the hilt of Zangetsu and prepared himself. This would be his first battle in the new land he was in. He couldn't feel anything special about the man, and mentally compared him to some of the unseated officers he'd met back in Soul Society. Turning to the side, he easily avoided the downward slash of the blade, followed by the horizontal slash. His bored look stayed in place throughout the weaves and dodges of every strike, infuriating the man as the battle went on. Bringing Zangetsu up, he stopped a diagonal slash and pushed the lightning blade to the side. Not wanting to show anything of use, he went on the offensive at the slowest speed he could. The blades clashed, but the force behind the attacks was greater than Rakusho had anticipated. The man's jaw was clenched tight, and the grip he had on the hilt was tight. Single-handed strikes collided with the yellow lightning, resulting in sparks flying in all directions. Parrying a counter-strike, Ichigo broke his stance and kicked him in the chest. Even though he held back considerably, he was sure he heard a crack on impact. Aoi grunted in pain and held his side before reaching over his shoulder and opening up his umbrella. Ninpo. Senbon shower, he yelled as he threw the umbrella into the air. Ichigo watched with mild interest as this would be the first technique he'd see up close. The umbrella began spinning in the air at high speeds before shooting off thin long needles in his directions. Raising an eyebrow, he swung Zangetsu in the air, releasing a strong pressure blast. The needles stopped their descent and were shot back into the air, penetrating trees. What? Aoi yelled in shock, seeing his attack be completely disregarded. Frowning in rage, he charged forward, the blade glowing a bright yellow as he pumped more chakra through it. Having had enough disappointment, Ichigo let his guard drop and allowed Aoi to get close. With an angry yell, he let out a horizontal slash, fully intending to bisect the Yugakure native. To his complete shock, however, the blade was caught barehanded in his left hand. Ichigo stared back at the shocked Aoi with a bit of mirth and began applying pressure to the blade. In the spot where Ichigo's hand had caught the blade, a hairline crack began to form, slowly traveling across the chakra construct. Seeing this, Aoi tried to pull back only to find himself completely stuck. Not giving him a chance to let go of the blade, Ichigo went on the offensive. Applying more force, the blade shattered. Before Aoi could process what had happened, Zangetsu was brought down with precision. From his left shoulder to the right side of his hip, a red line formed before splitting open, letting the blood flow from his body. It was a shallow cut but enough to do damage. Aoi fell face first into the small puddle beneath them, the hilt he was holding on to falling into the water. Pulling the hilt out, he inspected it quickly and tucked it into his pocket before slinging the unconscious man over his shoulder. The sound of his shunpo was drowned out by the rainfall that had begun to pick up once more. The skies soon cleared up, back to the familiar and much preferred clear skies. In only a few minutes he was well past the town that Tsunade and Shizune were waiting for him in. At the speed he was going, Konoha would be reached within the next minute or so. He mentally thanked Yurichi for her training, as this would easily be a few days' travel without her signature move. He stopped on a tree branch in the outskirts of the village. He could see a large wooden wall in the distance and knew he was there. Part of him was rather curious as to how different a major hidden village would be compared to the touristy areas he'd been in so far. Hopping down, he walked up to the large gate and made note of the two men situated at the front. That was already a major difference, there seemed to be security. They were dressed in matching uniforms consisting of blue pants and long sleeves, along with a green vest and a headband with the same symbol that was displayed proudly above the gates. One of the men noticed him along with the body over his shoulder and took a step forward. Halt, he ordered. State your name and business. Kurosaki Ichigo. Just here to claim a bounty, he replied, lifting Aoi's head up for them to see. The two looked at Aoi, and he saw a flash of recognition in their eyes. One of the men moved over to a small stall they had set up and pulled out a black book before flipping through the pages. Looking at his comrade, the man nodded. Follow me, the first man ordered. Ichigo stepped through the gates and took note of the designs of the village. While they were catered to gambling like the others, the buildings were mostly the same as what he'd seen before. Normally we would have the Hokage deal with this one considering his circumstances, but he's a bit preoccupied at the moment. The man told him. The Chunin exams are being held here, right? Ichigo asked, already knowing the answer. That's right, so things are pretty hectic right now. Instead of the Hokage, you'll be handing him over to our T&I department head. They have a little history, you see, he trailed off. He replied. The man seemed friendly enough, but behind that, he could tell he wasn't walking with just him. All around him he could feel different signatures following along. 6 different shinobi trailing from above. He thought, making sure to not look in their direction. Definitely wouldn't be able to look around without drawing suspicion. He was led to a large white and green building, where he saw the person he would be handing the man over to. He was dressed differently than the others. He wore dark pants and a matching shirt over a long black coat. The man had a bandana-style headband and a diagonal scar running across his face. Ibiki. The guard greeted, motioning to Ichigo. He's the one cashing in the bounty. Kurosaki Ichigo. The Shinigami greeted me politely. I'm here to collect the bounty on Akusho Hour, he declared, letting the body fall off his shoulder and catching him by the back of the shirt before he hit the ground. Ibiki glanced at him and then the body, before nodding to 2 other subordinates who stood alongside him. The 2 men walked forward and grabbed the body, laying it on the ground and inspecting it. They put 2 fingers up to his neck to confirm he was breathing, and nodded back at the scarred man. He's alive, the man told his superior. Perfect. You know what to do, he replied with a sadistic smile. Looking back towards Ichigo, the man reached into one of his pockets and pulled out a white scroll. Stepping forward, he held it out. Your payment. Ichigo glanced at the scroll and then backed up at the man. Had this been Yurihara paying him or anyone back from his world, perhaps he'd have taken it and left. But he was in the world of shinobi now, and from what he knew, they did things differently. If it's not too much to ask, can I request it be counted in front of me before accepting? Ibiki stared back at him and gave the smallest of smirks in response. Moving aside to the sign that read Intelligence Division, he unfurled the scroll and placed his hand in the center. A puff of smoke revealed a small stack of green bills which he then began to count. Once done, he sealed them back up and handed the scroll over. "A pleasure doing business," Ichigo replied. The guard which had brought him motioned for him to follow, and just as quickly as he'd gotten in, he was back outside the village. Thanking them for their help, he walked into the forest until he knew they wouldn't be able to see him anymore, and used Shunpo to disappear. Without the added weight of Aoi on his shoulder, he was able to move much faster. The trees came and went in a blur, and soon, the town was once again in sight. The sun was still shining bright in the sky, letting him know just how little time had actually passed. The entire capture and delivery of Aoi had taken no more than an hour. Stopping at the entrance of the town, he made his way towards the inn, and to his surprise, he could sense two specific signatures a few rooms over. Knocking on their door, he didn't have to wait long until Shizune opened and stared at him with surprise. "Ichigo, I thought you were going on a bounty hunt," she asked. Stepping inside, he nodded. "I did. I take it he wasn't found?" Tsunade asked from her spot where she laid on the bed. "No, he wasn't. I got word that he was in aim, but my good luck seems to stretch beyond casinos since I found another. Rakusho Aoi." Tsunade and Shizune blinked. They of course knew of him, and that he was wanted alive by Konoha, which was what surprised them. "And you're going to cash in his bounty when we go back?" Tsunade asked. "I hope you don't lose the scroll you sealed him in." He smirked. "He's already been dealt with," he said triumphantly, tossing the scroll in her direction. He didn't do it to gloat that he was finished, but rather for Tsunade to be the one to release the money held inside. Without chakra, he had no way of collecting his winnings, meaning he'd need someone else to do it in a way that wouldn't raise questions. He also used this weird sword. "Not sure how to activate it though," he said, getting their attention. Their surprise further increased when they saw him tossing the second Hokage's legendary blade up and down, like it wasn't an important relic. "Wait," Shizune suddenly said. "You went to the Land of Rain, captured him, went to Konoha to cash in the bounty, and came back all within an hour." Tsunade turned her attention away from the money to him. "How is that possible?" "I'm fast," he replied. Seeing the unamused looks he was getting, he went over to the bed where the money was laying and wrapped his Yugakure headband around the bills. It was a great thing they were large denominations and could still fit in his pockets. "Anyway, what do you say we get a nice meal and some drinks?" "On me." That was all Tsunade needed to hear to be on board. She could put aside her suspicion of what he pulled off for the time being. For now, she'd enjoy getting the best alcohol she could. Maybe with enough drinks she'd be able to get some answers, if not, well, she was resourceful. "Come on Shizune, join us," Tsunade said, putting Ichigo's head under her arm once more. "All we can eat." Ichigo wanted to point out that was what he'd said, but let it go. He was pretty well off, he could afford whatever they decided to eat and drink. Shizune smiled and got her stuff, following them out the door. "XXXX, is there something wrong?" A female's voice echoed through metal walls. Someone was nearby. "Someone I didn't recognize," a deep male voice replied. They were on the outskirts of the village, along with Rakusho Aoi. The man continued. The woman hummed. "You think he's stupid enough to try to pass information?" she asked. "No, Rakusho was unconscious, which leads me to believe he was beaten by someone. The other person's signature was strange, I can't exactly describe it. He disappeared shortly after I started the rain." "Disappeared?" the woman asked in a curious tone. "Disappeared. He remained in the rain for only a split second before he was gone." "Could it have been him?" she asked. The man shook his head. "No, this was speed. Nothing more." The woman seemed troubled by the information, and made her way to the small opening in the side of the building. Facing away from the man, she spoke. "I'll see if anyone knows something." The man didn't reply and kept his gaze out towards the dark skies above Omegakure. Whoever this person was would be someone to look out for. The kind of movement displayed was unnatural. Waking up to the sound of hard knocking on his door was not something Ichigo would want to get accustomed to. His eyes slowly opened as the knocking intensified, and his usual scowl fell into place. Grumbling to himself, he threw his legs off the side of the bed and walked over to the door. Ready to give a piece of his mind to whoever was knocking so loud, he opened the door with a bit more force than he had intended. Whatever he was going to say died when he realized it was Tsunade and Shizune. The black-haired woman was quick to look away with an embarrassed look on her face, and a tinge of red on her cheeks. Tsunade, however, simply looked down and up before raising an eyebrow. "I can appreciate a show in the morning, but go put on a shirt," she ordered. "What? Why?" he asked, turning to look at the clock. "It's 8 in the morning, and did you have to knock so loud?" he asked with a bit of irritation seeping into his voice. "We've been knocking for 5 minutes. Not our fault you weren't waking up," she said with a shrug. "Anyways, it's time to win some money," she said, finally answering his first 2 questions. "You went to make your own money and left me out to dry." That was true, he had gone on the bounty and left her to her own devices. "Now hurry up and put a shirt on, and let's go or I'll drag you out as you are," she ordered, crossing her arms and giving him a look. Her words made him think of Ikumi, and the multiple times she'd all but dragged him away from places. On more than one occasion when he was out with friends or getting a snack for himself, the woman would show up with a crazed look on her face and proceed to kidnap him and drag him to work. Usually he'd end up with rope tied around his body and stuffed in the back of her van before being taken to do manual labor with her. Realizing that he had been daydreaming, he exhaled and nodded. "Fine, just give me a minute," he said as he closed the door. A moment later he emerged with his usual clothing and zanjutsu on its rightful place along his back. "Great, now let's go," Tsunade ordered. Closing the door behind him, he walked a step behind Shizune. "You're gonna be gambling with us too?" he asked in a bored tone. There was no other reason she would be tagging along unless she was there to babysit the older woman. Shizune shook her head and covered her mouth with her right hand and let out a lengthy yawn. Rubbing her eyes to get a bit of the morning crust out of the corner of her eyes, she responded. "No, I'm gonna be a lookout for you guys in case people start getting suspicious," she responded. "You know Lady Tsunade doesn't really make the best decisions once you start winning." Ichigo nodded. He could understand though, the woman wasn't a good gambler, so whenever she started winning large amounts of money, the dopamine in her brain was released causing her to want to continue. Still though, that didn't mean the poor girl had to be forced to come along with them if he was there. He had enough sense to know when to quit and move tables. They exited the inn and walked for 15 minutes to a new casino Tsunade wanted to go to. This one was much louder than the rest they had visited, even from where they stood a ways down the street. They could hear the sounds of machines at high volumes consuming people's money at a rapid pace. Turning around to face them, Tsunade placed her hands on her hips and began to give them the rundown. Staring at Ichigo primarily, she began. "Alright. Our best game is cards." Ichigo thought to himself. Keeping his thoughts to himself, he focused on her again. "So here's our strategy. I'll go in first and play a few tables, and you'll be the cheat that comes in and cleans the house," she explained before shooting him a look. With a huff of amusement, she continued. "Pretty much, just be yourself." Shizune rubbed her forehead at Tsunade's words. The woman really couldn't help but take a shot at the younger man. Even though he'd more than paid them back for how much he'd won off her, Tsunade still childishly went out of her way to remind him that he was a common. The only saving grace for her was that Ichigo was above the childish banter most of the time. He'd only been traveling with them for a little bit, but already had a pretty solid idea on how to defuse situations. "Alright, so I make the money while you lose it," he replied with a look of his own. "Pretty much like any other day then," he shot back, looking very pleased with himself. Not wanting the bickering to start between the two, Shizune stepped forward past them, pushing the two by the back as she did so. "Let's just go. I didn't wake up this early to listen to the two of you behave like kids," she chastised. Tsunade followed along and made her way inside first. Like always, Ichigo waited for a few minutes, stopping by a small stand nearby, just casually browsing the selection of goods available. After about 10 minutes of waiting, he headed inside, cringing slightly at the volume of everything going on. No matter how many times he'd entered these types of places, he never got used to it. The only thing louder were the pachinko parlors around the neighborhoods back home. Ichigo couldn't count the number of times Kigo dragged him to one, or he had to go rough up some people fucking up some resting places for spears. He made his way to the machines available and sat down to play a few rounds. He made sure to sit at a machine where Tsunade's reflection would be visible in the reflection of the glass. Unsurprisingly, he lost every round he played due to the machines being rigged, but that didn't really matter. Keeping his eyes on the woman's back, he waited until 5 or 6 more rounds passed before standing up and making his way to the table. "My turn," he thought. Taking a seat at one of the 2 open chairs, he placed a stack of bills on the table and allowed them to be taken and replaced by red chips. Like last time, 2 cards were placed in front of him and the others, and soon the maths began. The next 3 games that were played went in his favor, racking up quite a bit of chips. The following 2 were lost on purpose to avoid suspicion. Tsunade glanced at him but kept a cool face, as if pretending she didn't know him, but he knew she was curious as to why he was losing games. Placing 2 more chips on the table, he asked for a card and held it in place. Tsunade did the same, but she went over the limit and thus lost once more. Tossing 3 chips forward, he asked for cards and began counting mentally. He could win the hand as the ratio was in his favor, but he could see the dealer beginning to look at him more. Making it a point not to move his mouth while he counted, he did his best to keep his eyes steady, to not give anything away. He knew too high of a card was coming up and called anyway. As he expected, his hand was too high and to everyone's surprise, Tsunade took the pot. She smirked at the men around her and pulled the chips towards her with a greedy but proud look. Shaking his head at her antics, he casually tossed more chips and continued. A few more hours and a few more tables later, and the chips he'd started with had grown well over 5 times their size. High denomination chips were in his pocket along with 4 small stacks on the current table he and Tsunade were playing. She had gone out of her way to make herself look like a challenger against him personally. Only 4 bets into the new table, Ichigo stood up and called it a day. Grabbing 3 of the higher denomination chips, he slid them across the table to the dealer. "For you." The shady-looking man at the table took a puff of his cigarette and took the chips happily. "A pleasure." If there was one way to win people over, it was by sharing the profits. Especially when it came to gambling. After getting cashed out and making sure the bills were safely tucked away, he made his way back to the machines to try his luck. Tsunade stayed at the table, proceeding to lose 4 games back-to-back before standing up angrily and leaving. The Shinigami noticed her exiting the building but didn't follow after her. Out of the corner of his eye he could see a group of men staring in his direction. They watched Tsunade making her way out, and then all of their attention was drawn towards him. I knew he drew a bit too much attention. He thought to himself with a bit of annoyance. Tsunade can't act to save her life. Fortunately, after about 20 minutes of losing low-stakes bets, the men finally dispersed. Once the eyes were off of him, he left the building and with a shunpo, he was gone. Appearing back at the inn, he walked towards his room, taking a sniff of his shirt, hoping it didn't smell too much like tobacco. Opening his room door, he blinked at the sight of Tsunade laying on his bed with her head resting on her hands. "About time you got here," she said casually, sitting up and crossing her legs. "How'd you get in my room?" he asked with no real anger. "I'm a shinobi," she replied as if it was the obvious thing in the world, which around here it would be, right? "Stupid question. I guess it doesn't matter, it's not like I have anything of value here," he replied. Tsunade nodded. "Glad you get it, now how much did we win?" she asked, not to hide the giddiness in her voice. Approaching the bed, he pulled out all the bills he'd accumulated and laid them in neat stacks next to her. Tsunade watched as the man continued pulling more and more banded stacks of bills out with stars in her eyes. "How much did you lose?" he asked, not stopping his movements. He was aware of the narrow-eyed look she shot him, and half expected some snarky retort, but shockingly she let it drop. "About 20,000. The woman replied casually. Well, he couldn't be sure about an exact conversion rate. By comparing goods prices here to similar ones back home, he made an estimate as to how Ryo translated into yen. If she lost 20,000, it wasn't too bad, but how many times had she lost that amount before she met him? "Have you ever considered maybe gambling isn't for you?" "I've thought about it, yes." "Now how much did we win?" she asked impatiently. Ichigo placed 20,000 into her palm and began sorting through the rest of the bills. He separated them, placing an even amount to the left and to the right of her. "We made just over 500,000. That's your half right there," he said, pointing to the neatly stacked bills to her left. She scooped the bills up into her hands and counted them with a grin on her face. Anyone who won that much money would be excited, so he couldn't blame her, but seeing how happy she was brought forth a question he'd been sitting on for a bit. "Tsunade," he called out. Stopping the count, she left her index finger in between a few bills, so that she wouldn't lose her place. Nodding her head to the side to move some stray hair, she replied. "What is it? If you don't mind me asking, exactly how much debt do you owe?" The question caught her momentarily off guard, but she soon began to hum silently to herself. Ichigo saw her lips moving softly, calculating how much she owed. He wasn't a pro at reading lips, but he could make out some people's names in there along with a few numbers. Somewhere in the range of 15 million. His eyes almost bugged out of his head at the number. One would think that after going down into 1 million, someone would cut their losses and give up, but Tsunade had clearly never thought of that. Keeping that bit of info in his mind, he carefully wrapped the headband around his money and stashed it away in the drawer next to his bed. "Why don't you just place the money into the scroll you got from Konoha?" Tsunade questioned curiously. Thinking on his feet, he replied without hesitation. "It's easy to lose a scroll. It's harder to lose a larger bundle like this." The blonde hummed at the response but let it drop. Moving off of his bed, she slipped her feet into her heels that rested bedside and walked towards the door, stopping just short of the handle. "Just so you know, we won't be here much longer." "We won't?" he questioned. "I thought we had a couple more days. Although that's probably a good idea, some of the people at the casino started watching me after you left. We're not leaving for that reason, there's just been a change of plans. I want to relax a little bit, so in 2 days we'll be heading to Yugakure." Her eyes were fixed on the orange-haired man in front of her, scanning for any changes in his facial reactions or tensing of the body. He stopped for a moment and then shrugged in a nonchalant manner. "I thought you were relaxing here," he commented, taking a seat. "I was, but like you said, they're already watching us. If we show up anywhere together again, they'll probably know for certain. Anyways, I could use a nice soak in a hot spring. I never got the chance to visit for vacation purposes, but now I can," she commented, still trying to find any negative reactions. "Plus, I want to see if the hot springs really are as good as people say." He nodded and pulled the blanket to the side. "That's fine. I'm sure you'll like it. Alright then, I'll see you tomorrow. Good night." The door opened and closed, leaving Ichigo alone once again. Turning the lights off, he attempted to get some sleep, but his eyes shot open within seconds of closing them. "Fuck," he thought. "I've never been to Yugakure. They're gonna expect me to know where we're going, which spots have the best food and what hot springs to visit." Taking a few deep breaths to calm himself, he went over his options rationally. "I have 2 days, it's alright. I can visit the library tomorrow." He shook his head soon after the thought crossed his mind. "That wouldn't work. If anything, it would only give me the names of minor landmarks. Books don't account for things like local spots, shortcuts, and things in between. After half an hour of pondering, he came to the conclusion that he would be needing to take a small detour the following day. It was the only option. Having thought up something of a plan, he closed his eyes and tried getting some sleep. He could vaguely smell the light scent of Tsunade enter his nose, and he remembered that she had been laying here for who knows how long. Morning came in the blink of an eye, and mercifully, there was no loud knocking on his door this time. 8 o'clock was quickly approaching, and he knew the ladies would be waking up soon if they hadn't already. Taking a quick shower and grabbing another set of the same clothes he always wore, he walked over to their room. As his knuckles came in contact with the door, part of him wanted to knock just a bit harder, but he refused to fall to Tsunade's level. Shizune opened the door, dressed in her usual clothing, but with an added towel resting on her head for her hair. "Morning, Shizune. Just wanted to let you guys know I won't be around today. I'm gonna take care of another bounty," he informed her. "Really? Didn't Lady Tsunade tell you we were leaving soon?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, she said we are leaving tomorrow. I'll be back later tonight or early tomorrow morning. Also, tell her to please not lose all the money we won. I can't promise she'll listen, but I'll let her know. Good luck." With his excuse solidified, Ichigo left the inn and quickly left the town. The surrounding environment blurred by. The trees that surrounded the land of fire quickly disappeared until he reached his destination only a moment later. Ichigo could only wonder what he would do without having the ability to shunpo. It took a few extra minutes as a result of a couple of wrong turns. He'd never been there and only had what he'd seen from maps, but eventually, he made it back on track. Stopping at a large torii gate that welcomed new arrivals, he took a moment to look around. To his right was a railing that protected people from falling into the large ravine below. There was a body of water that was fed by a large waterfall just a few yards away. On his right was a small souvenir shop that sold minor trinkets that one would get to commemorate their trip. Directly ahead was a path that went downward into the village itself. Taking a few steps forward, he stopped and took in the admittedly breathtaking sight. In almost all directions he could see a variety of different onsen to choose from. Some had large rock formations that were carefully carved to create certain shapes that matched the design of the onsen. Others were built into rock formations that had natural waterfalls. Heading deeper into the village, he took note of everything including the smaller stands within small alleys. The sun was high in the sky, meaning he had plenty of time to get acquainted with the village and memorize the layout. Picking a random direction, he began walking, looking every bit the tourist he really was. The hot springs themselves were easy to spot and memorize, but there were so many food places it would be hard to keep track of all of them. Perhaps he could say some were new, and that's why he didn't recognize them. Hour after hour passed and Ichigo found himself getting a good feel for the land. He'd taken plenty of laps around the village and for the most part had the biggest onsen committed to memory. Whether they were good or not was another story entirely. He had to stop for lunch at a small restaurant and figured it would be the perfect place to recommend when the time to return came tomorrow. Every small alleyway that led to another street, he took at least once. Shortcuts had been found and mentally documented, surely adding to the authenticity of his story. Once the sun had begun to descend and its bright yellow rays had been replaced with the burnt orange associated with the sunset, he figured it was time for the final part of his plan. There was always room for things to go wrong. If he could hedge them now, he'd be in an almost perfect position. On the off chance that the woman figured out he'd been here, there would undoubtedly be questions. Some that he would not be able to weasel out of. As much as he wished he could not come up with valid reasons for things like your heart. "Young man, you seem lost. Need help finding your way around?" A man who seemed to be in his mid-40s asked. "Oh, kind of. Seeing as this is a tourist attraction, is it possible to rent out an onsen for a specified period of time?" he asked. The man nodded. "It's possible, but like you said, it's a tourist attraction so it'll be pricey. If that's no issue for you, might I make a recommendation?" He nodded. "If you walk down the street here and make a left passing the weapons shop, there's an onsen with one of the natural waterfalls. The nice thing is that the water splits due to formations in the rock face, so both the men and women's side get their own personal waterfall. Beautiful place." Ichigo went through the village in his mind, taking the directions he'd been told. "You're referring to Ichigo?" he asked, naming the onsen he believed they were talking about. "The very same. Just tell whoever's working today that old man Yamada sent you." "Old man Yamada, huh?" he muttered. Thanking him, he followed the directions given and stepped through the doors of the onsen. There was a woman probably in her 20s behind a small counter reading a book. Looking up, she quickly put it down and put a smile on her face. "Welcome. Just one?" she asked in her customer service voice. "Oh no, I'm actually looking to rent the place out for a few hours tomorrow. Old man Yamada sent me," he informed her. Her eyes widened slightly, knowing that it would be an expensive request. Flipping through a large notebook, she trailed her pen over the page while muttering to herself. Her face lit up after a moment. "You're in luck, there's nothing going on tomorrow." "You said Yamada sent you?" she asked. Not waiting for a reply, she continued. "That guy is working even when he's not here," she added with a laugh. "Rental prices are 15,000 ryo per hour. Do you have an idea of how long you would like? Also, what time would it begin so we can plan accordingly? She asked in a professional tone. Ichigo tapped his chin in thought. He wasn't sure when they would get here, but it couldn't be too late. They'd have to leave rather early to make it at a reasonable time. How about from 1 to 5 p.m? Okay, so 4 hours. That'll be 60,000 ryo total. A 25% deposit will be necessary, however. Pulling out the few loose bills he had, he was pleased to see it was just over the necessary amount. Placing 20,000 down, he waited a moment while she filled out the information on 2 separate papers. All she needed was his name, and within another minute, he was on his way. By the time he was done with everything, the sun had already set. Making his way back up the path towards the front of the village, he let his hand glide across the railing, whistling a soft tune from back home. It wasn't until he finally crossed the torii gate that the whistling stopped. The souvenir stand had closed already, and most of the light now came from the village down below. Letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, he remembered how he got there and backtracked his steps. It took a bit longer to make it back due to the darkness of the night. There were no light posts along the way like there was for the people back home, so he had to be careful, lest he break through a tree at the crazy speeds he was moving. Though difficult, he did eventually see the lights of the town in the distance. Crossing through the front gate, he arrived at the inn and walked to his room. He yawned as he opened the door and stepped inside. That was the most walking he'd done since he arrived. Stashing the money and placing Zangetsu against the wall, he walked into the bathroom. He emerged 15 minutes later in his nightwear consisting of only his boxers, and tucked himself under the sheets. Yesterday's issues had been sorted, and this time, he had no problems getting to sleep. The next morning he was up at the crack of dawn, freshly showered and ready for the day. Gathering all his things, which weren't much, he recounted how much money he had, and left 3 bills out of the stack, which was then wrapped up once more. Sitting back down at the edge of the mattress, he took a look through the bingo book, wanting to memorize as many faces as he could. One never knew when they might run into someone who was worth some money. The incident with Rakusho Aoi proved that. The thought of the Omegakure shinobi made him reach into one of his pockets to pull out the hilt he'd relieved from the man. He almost snickered to himself when he remembered the reactions Tsunade and Shizune had to his treatment of it. During their dinner he had used it as something of a paperweight to keep his money from being blown off the table. He'd been informed that the blade belonged to the second Hokage, and was a very valuable tool. They had been scandalized at the blatant disregard for it, even after knowing who it belonged to. Knowing that it did belong to her family, he had offered it up to Tsunade. She had been surprised that he was willing to part with it for free, and even more so when she learned he was uninterested in using it at all. Tucking it back into his pocket, he continued page by page until a knock on his door broke his concentration. Folding the corner of the page belonging to Tsurutobi Asume, he closed the book and opened the door. "Morning." Tsunade greeted me. "It's time to go. We're roughly 3 hours away from Yugakure, so we'll walk a little faster than usual. Once we get there we'll stop for a bite and then make our way to the hot springs. We'll be counting on you." He nodded confidently. With the information he'd gathered yesterday, he would be able to play the perfect tour guide. Making sure he'd left nothing behind, he closed the door and followed them out of the inn. Having Tsunade leading them out made it a less complicated trip than when he'd gone by himself. She must have traveled around for a while because not once did they get lost in the 3 hours they walked. That wasn't to say things were uneventful. He did manage to find out one thing about Tsunade. She had a nickname. One that he never expected. During another one of their arguments about Tsunade losing money while he was gone, Shizune let it slip that she had been nicknamed the legendary sucker. He was partially ashamed to say gambling wasn't the only thing that crossed his mind at the name. Soon, they once again made it to the same torii gate he'd seen yesterday, and Tsunade slowed her pace. "These are your stomping grounds," she said simply. "We'll take your lead from here. Mind taking us to a good place for lunch?" Agreeing, he stepped forward to take the lead and walked them down towards the village. He knew where he'd be taking them, and also knew that the big streets would get them there in about 10 minutes. "This is where my detour comes in handy," he thought proudly. Making a sharp left turn towards a narrow alleyway, he motioned them to follow. "Come on, we can take a shortcut through here," he said confidently. The women glanced at each other and followed shortly behind. Stepping out, they found themselves on the next larger street, and watched the orange-haired man open the doors to a 2-story restaurant and look back at them. "They have amazing beef here. I'm sure you ladies will love it." Tsunade hummed and nodded approvingly at the decor of the inside. It really seemed to fit well with the architecture of the rest of the village. The food was a little overpriced, but given that they were in a tourist trap, a larger one than the small towns they'd been in, it was to be expected. The trio lounged at their table for a few minutes to let the meal digest some before heading out. "Alright Ichigo, this place is full of hot springs. Which one is the best?" Tsunade asked, placing a hand on her hip. "Follow me." A short walk later and they were in front of Ikaho once more, with only a few minutes remaining before their scheduled time. Stepping inside, Ichigo was ready to speak with the same woman from the day before, but had to do a double take when he saw Yamada behind the counter. "Mr. Kurosaki." The man greeted me joyfully. Ichigo felt his blood run cold. What the hell was he doing here? I tried finding you yesterday to see if you took my recommendation for the onsen, but I'm glad you did. Tsunade and Shizune turned to Ichigo with narrowed eyes. What were you doing here yesterday? For that matter, why did you need a recommendation? You said you knew everything about this place. Tsunade asked. Refusing to lose his cool, he walked up to the counter. Well, I decided to be a good host, so I rented out a place for a few hours for us. He replied, reaching into his pocket to pull the remaining 40,000 he owed. As for why I needed a recommendation, I haven't been here for a while now. Some things have changed and I never had to rent one out in the past. I told you if you've been to one onsen, you've been to them all. He replied, once again thinking on his feet. Yamada's eyes caught the glint of the steel on the headband, and a surprised look crossed his face. I haven't seen one of those in a while, he said, referring to the Yugakure headband. I can see why you'd be out of the loop. He continued, unknowingly helping Ichigo's story. A few of the onsen that were around back during our shinobi days were completely remodeled or renamed after being bought out. Another reason I recommended this one, other than working here, is because it's one of the few that still offer separate areas for men and women. Tsunade still looked unconvinced, but she didn't press the issue further. Ichigo was certain though that sooner or later, his luck would run out, and he would have no escape when certain questions were asked. Perfect. Thank you for your patronage. Yamada replied with a bow before a sheepish look appeared on his face. Now I do have one request if you don't mind. Specifically for the sole member in front of me. The blonde blinked but wasn't too surprised he knew her. Almost anyone in the shinobi world did by now. What is it? Would it be too much to ask for us to take a picture of you in front of our establishment? It would be a boon to our business, he requested. Seeing that she was on the fence, he added, you'll be compensated of course. That was all she needed to hear. 5 minutes later they were led off down a corridor that split behind a blue sign for men and a red sign for women. Well, we have the place for the next 4 hours, and I intend to make use of every minute. Come on Shizune, she said before turning to Ichigo. I'm not sure what the layout of the place is, but I'll say it anyway, if you try to peep I'll kill you. She threatened. Rolling his eyes at the threat, he nodded anyway and walked off to his side. XXXX. The two women were left alone in the changing room. They could vaguely hear the sound of flowing water from behind the white sliding door that separated them from the actual area. Removing their clothing and neatly folding them, they placed them into a locker provided and wrapped their bodies in white towels. Tsunade did her hair up in a ponytail and opened the door to see what the area looked like. The water was clear as could be with a light coat of steam rising from the temperature. Rocks lined the perimeter with some of them spewing more water into the large pools. Tall wooden walls surrounded the area, and the clear sky above was on full display. It's strange seeing a place like this so calm in the day, Shizune commented, stepping beside the woman. Tsunade nodded. On any given day it would be full, but we're lucky it's been rented out for us. Come on, I'm dying to take a dip. One foot followed the other, and soon, her entire body was submerged with the water reaching up above her breasts. The woman let out content sighs as any fatigue they may have felt was all but washed away. The bustier of the two reached down and pulled her towel off of her body before rinsing it off and placing it atop her head. Leaning back against one of the rocks, he leaned her head back and closed her eyes, taking a moment to enjoy the sensation. This is nice, don't you think? She asked her younger friend. It is. I'm actually surprised Ichigo did this for us. It cost him about 60,000 ryo from what I managed to see on the receipt. Shizune commented. The mention of the name made Tsunade's eyes snap open. Yeah, me too. Say, Shizune. Have you noticed there's something not quite right with our new friend? She asked slowly, trying to piece together how she would ask what's been on her mind. Shizune frowned and thought back to everything she knew of the man. He seems friendly enough. Other than that I haven't really had much of a concern about him. Do you think something's wrong with him? Tsunade frowned and shook her head. I'm not sure. I'm mostly referring to the way his chakra feels. The only way I can describe it is as if he only has yin chakra, she explained. Ever since they agreed to travel together she'd had that feeling. Something about his chakra just wasn't right. I can't say I have, but he definitely does have a different presence compared to others. There's also his speed that I'm curious about. He was able to travel to Omegakure and Konoha, then back to us within an hour. He said he's just fast, but I'm not sure. Then there's his trip here yesterday. He said he was on a bounty hunt but was gone most of the day. If he knew his way around, finding an onsen shouldn't have taken all day. What else could he have done? Shizune was silent for a moment before replying, giving Ichigo the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he did go on the hunt. He could seemingly go anywhere he wanted with his speed, maybe that took his time. Tsunade was still uncertain, things seemed strange, but she didn't get bad vibes from the young man. Having been around as long as she had, she thought herself a good judge of character. Ichigo was a bit rough around the edges, but he wasn't a bad guy, she knew that much for sure. Maybe she was being paranoid, but even though his reasoning for the things he did had some validity to them, something in the back of her mind still nagged at her. Sighing, she tried pushing it out of her mind. He'd gone out of his way to book them 4 hours of what felt like heaven, and she was going to enjoy them. Letting her body sink just a little deeper, she let herself relax. On the other side of the wall, Ichigo was feeling the same type of bliss as the two ladies. Having dipped into the water, for a brief moment it felt like he was home. Closing his eyes, he could picture a time when he and his friends had gone to an onsen, having a blast between them. For half an hour, his body soaked and the warm water absorbed all the built-up stress he'd felt over the past few days. Things could have definitely been worse, but he was still in a land far away from home. His head snapped up and he stood up quickly as an idea passed through his mind. With everything that had been going on, he'd forgotten about one thing. Something important that he would do his best to rectify right this second. Making sure his towel was still wrapped around his waist, he ran inside to grab his and made his way back out. He sat on the ground and crossed his legs. Closing his eyes, he placed on his legs, took calm breaths, and ignored everything around him. The world seemed to go silent, and the light that could still go through his eyelids slowly faded away. The darkness surrounded him before a feeling similar to what one experienced while falling fell over him. Soon, he found himself staring at the large buildings that made up his inner world. The first thing he noticed was the many droplets of rain falling over his being. Looking up, he saw dark clouds overhead as far as he could see. The sound of rain was the only thing that reached his ears as he walked. It was as if his inner world was devoid of anything other than him. His right ear twitched as the sound of steel clanging against each other reached him. However, just as he took a step in the direction of the battle, everything went quiet. While he didn't even have enough time to think before he felt his body forced into the grip of something alien to himself. The rain intensified, and the grip on him began to pull him in separate directions, as if playing a game of tug-of-war with his soul. His body ached, but no sound would escape him even as he tried to scream. The buildings in his sight began to fade, black spots quickly filled his vision, closing off his sight. The tugging continued up until his vision had gone completely black, and Ichigo soon found himself back in the onsen. Zangetsu was on the ground, and he was supporting himself with his arms as he stared at the wet ground beneath him. His heart was beating rapidly in his chest, and adrenaline pumped through him. He took in large gasps of air, trying desperately to control himself from what he had just experienced. While his body seemed fine, the despair behind his brown eyes could not be missed. Grabbing Zangetsu, he shakily stood up and placed it against one of the large rocks, before letting himself dip back into the soothing warm water. Staring up at the clear sky, he couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. He'd been expelled from his own inner world and felt like something was fighting for control of him. Steadying his breathing, he let the warm spring water relax his body, and soon his heart fell back into rhythm. For the remaining time that he had, he allowed himself to temporarily forget what had transpired. As concerning as his attempt had been, he wasn't one to quit. He would try again soon, hopefully this time without issues. When there was only 10 minutes left, he stood up and used the shower that was built into the locker rooms to clean himself off. The water had been for him alone, but it was just something to do for hygiene. He waited out front for Tsunade and Shizune to emerge, and they looked much happier than they did when they had arrived. That was amazing, Tsunade said, stretching her arms over her head. I haven't felt this good in a long time. Shizune nodded. Same here. Thank you for this, Ichigo. I'm sure if it had been full, the experience wouldn't have been as pleasant. He waved off their thanks and led them to an inn to book rooms before they filled up. Fortunately, the top floor of a nearby inn had yet to have any rooms booked, and they were able to get two next door to each other. As much as he wanted to lay in bed and once again ponder the events of his inner world, he knew the ladies would be expecting him to walk them around the village. XXXX. Shutting the door to his room later that night, Ichigo unceremoniously let himself fall face first into the bed, and then rolled over onto his back. With a blank look, he stared at the white ceiling and let his thoughts be consumed. I know I heard blades clashing. They were there, he thought with a frown. What the hell happened today? His eyes focused once more and looked towards the door where a second later, a knock rang out. Knowing it could only be one of two people, he called out. It's open. Tsunade stepped inside, dressed in her usual attire, except she lacked her usual green robe. It was the first time he'd seen her without it, and he noticed the shirt was actually sleeveless, revealing rather toned arms. He knew she was a medic, but it seemed she trained for more than healing. Can't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Haven't tried yet. I just had a thought and decided to come ask you about something. He stared at her, waiting for her to continue. I was just curious. You grew up here, wouldn't it have been cheaper for us to have just stayed with your family or something? You spent quite a bit on the rental and even paid for lunch. It would have been beneficial to save a bit, don't you think? She asked in a curious tone. What happened next was not at all what she'd been expecting. Ichigo's eyes dropped slightly, and she could almost feel the depression that rolled off of the young man. The look in his eyes was one that she was all too familiar with, one that came from loneliness and sorrow. Her assumptions were proven correct a moment later when he replied. Believe me, I'd have loved that. He began in a sad tone. My family is gone, Tsunade. My mom died when I was a kid, my dad and two younger sisters I lost not too long ago. I have no one here. He replied honestly. The medic could empathize with the young man as she was in the same boat. Years had passed for her, and in a way she wasn't completely alone, since she had Shizune, but Ichigo, he had no one. She felt slightly guilty that she had opened up some clearly still fresh wounds. "I'm sorry," she muttered, taking a seat next to him. This had not gone the way she had expected. Who would have thought that the first time she wouldn't feel anything wrong with him was when she forced him into a vulnerable state by bringing up his dead family. She hadn't said it out loud, but she had grown somewhat fond of the man. Through all their bickering and bantering, she couldn't deny that things had definitely looked up since he joined them. Not only did he help her make money, he also proved to be able to hold a decent conversation, and never once complained about any of her non-gambling related decisions. Seeing him in a depressed state reminded her too much of herself years ago. The loneliness he was feeling was something no one should go through by themselves. In a moment of compassion, her left arm extended out. Ichigo was certain his head was about to be squeezed in between her arm once again, and most likely let off somewhere. He was wrong. Her hand gripped his head, and he found it pull toward her until he collided against something soft. Looking to the side, all he could see was the gray color of her shirt and side of her breast he was being pressed against. It wasn't lost on him that this was the second time this exact thing had happened to him. Ikumi had done the same when she saw him in a similar state. "I'm sorry for bringing up bad memories," she muttered in a soft tone. He allowed himself to relax and enjoyed the feeling of having someone try to comfort him. Even if she didn't know the entire story, he definitely appreciated the act. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.